approaches it with a sigh.
"Look what we have here,"
he says under his breath. Snarling noisily, its iridescent eyes widening at the glare of a flashlight in its face, it bites at the space in front of Bob.
"Something I want you to know,"
Bob says. He presses the barrel against the creature's forehead. At this close proximity, with Bob standing only inches away from the thing, the smell is overwhelming. Its flesh the consistency of spackling compound, as pallid as bread dough. It's not often Bob gets a chance to address one of these things in such an intimate fashion. Just the two of them, close quarters, smelling each other.
"Her name was Gloria Pine,"
Bob informs the creature, then squeezes off a single blast that blows a divot through the top of its skull. Magnified by the enclosed space, the roar deafens Bob for a moment. He jumps back, trying to avoid the flood of black cerebrospinal fluid gushing down into the dirt as the thing's ruined head and shoulders instantly sag and hang lifeless in the merciless beam of light. Bob spits. He scowls at the ventilated scalp, the decaying mass of brain matter now visible and glistening inside the gaping hole in the bone and dermal layers. In his life, Bob Stuckey has never felt such hatred deep in his marrow. The muffled sound of other cadavers milling about behind the wall of loose earth shakes Bob out of his daze. He swallows the grief welling up in him. Just as mere mention of Gloria's name, spoken aloud in this lonely, God-forsaken tunnel, has put the squeeze on his heart, and he spits again, shaking it off, taking a deep breath.
"Don't worry, folks, I haven't forgotten you."
Time to get down to business. He carefully shrugs off his pack and sets it gently on the ground. He unzips it, fishes around, and gingerly pulls out the wooden cigar box with the words Dino Noble stenciled on the sides. He crouches, shines the flashlight on it, and opens the lid. The sticks are nestled in sawdust.
"Got a message from Gloria for you,"
Bob murmurs under his breath as he pulls the first stick of dynamite from the box he and Gloria found in the mining office. He rises up and carefully inserts the dull end of the stick into the cave-in wall near the ceiling. He inserts 3 more sticks into the cave-in at key junctures along the ceiling, then winds the ancient safety fuse from blasting cap to blasting cap. There's no telling if the fuse is viable. God only knows how long this stuff was down there in that mining office. Bob's not even sure if it'll ignite the explosives, nor is he certain the caravan will pass this way en route to Woodbury. It's all guesswork at this point, but what else can they do? He inserts a half-dozen more sticks into the dirt ceiling. Then he unwinds the fuse coil along the tunnel about 50 feet or so and finds a bucket on which to sit. He sits down and he pulls his walkie-talkie.
"Okay, it's all set. Over."
A moment later, Lily's faint voice crackles through the static. "Okay, stand by," Bob says.
"Will do,"
then releases the button and puts the walkie back on his belt. Then he waits. And waits. Miles Littleton yanks the wheel and careens off River Cove Road, then rushes headlong down a narrow dirt path that winds through the dark woods, his headlamp sweeping across dense walls of foliage, the vibrations rattling his bones and making the rear end of the Challenger fishtail in the dirt. The muscle car throws a tidal wave of dust behind it as it roars toward the grove of trees outside the tunnel entrance. Normally, as instructed by Lily, Miles would park about a mile away, where the fleet of vehicles used by the tunnel dwellers lies hidden under the cover of thick live oaks. But time is of the essence now, and he can't spare the 15-minute walk from the fleet to the tunnel entrance. He slams on the brakes just as the car rounds the final curve. The inertia sucks him forward, throwing debris as the Challenger goes into a sideways skid. He jerks the wheel into the skid, expertly preventing the massive, low-slung sedan from going into a spin. The car scrapes to a noisy stop 1,000 feet south of the tunnel entrance near a dry riverbed. Miles lets out a tense breath, throws the door open, and leaps out. He charges through the shadows until he comes to the ragged red bandana on the stick, barely visible in the darkness. He sees the string sticking out of the ground, tied to a stump, and he grabs and pulls. "Hey, Lily, Norma, it's me." He waits. Yo, folks! Let me in, it's Miles!" He tries to pry open the manhole cover, but they have the clamps in place. The tunnel's on high alert. He knocks. Yo, people! Let me in! The ground around the manhole vibrates slightly as somebody pulls off the clamps and pushes it open. All at once, Lily Call's sweaty face appears in the darkness below, and her arm shoots up, and she clutches the collar of Miles Littleton's worn hoodie. Jesus Christ, Miles, you're gonna draw the whole fucking swarm! He climbs down the embedded steps behind her and hops down onto the hard-packed floor of the tunnel. The impact sends stars across his field of vision, and he's momentarily blind in the gloomy atmosphere of the underground. He hears Norma's voice. What the love of Christ is going on? Wasn't you supposed to radio in? Goddamn batteries, Miles says between heaving breaths, blinking as his eyes adjust. Lily's voice is closer. Didn't we just check them? I don't think so. Miles leans down with his hands on his knees as he catches his breath. He can see Lily Call standing over him with an ammo magazine in one hand, a walkie-talkie in the other. Miles looks at her. Them damn things were shot, leaking shit all over the insides of the radio. Walkie was dead as fuck. Damn it. I told Bob we should have... Lily starts to say when Miles speaks up. They're closer than we thought. Dude, I think they're gonna be here by sunup. Lily looks at him. What? She licks her lips, looks around the narrow chamber of petrified earth and ancient pilings. By this point, Tommy Dupree, David Stern, and Harold Staubach have each heard the commotion and have come over to stand behind Lily with tense expressions. Speaking almost to herself, Lily says, That's like what? Like an hour from now? Miles shrugs and meets her gaze, but he doesn't say anything. David Stern compulsively wrings his hands. He wears a black windbreaker with the Falcons logo almost completely worn off its breast pocket. The underarm area is already damp with stress sweat. Are you absolutely sure? He gapes incredulously at the young car thief. We need to be sure. Miles nods. I saw him on the west side of Thomaston Woods, heading up 74 about 5 miles away from the crossroads. From Highway 18 you're talking about. Miles nods. And the worst part? They got like twice as many walkers as we thought. It's like a fucking army following along behind them. Like 100 motherfucking marching bands just following along as happy as you please. Lily looks down, chews her lips, thinks, and then looks up at Miles. How long ago was it you saw them at Thomaston Woods? Miles shrugs. Like a half hour ago? Fuck. Fuck! Lily raises the walkie-talkie to her lips and thumbs the button. Bob, can you hear me? Sitting in the darkness of the Elkins Creek Tunnel, directly under the town of Carlinville, Georgia, Bob jumps at the sound of Lily's voice crackling out of his two-way, echoing in the desolate passageway. Bob! Bob! Bob, goddammit, talk to me! Bob hits the button.
I'm still here, girly girl. You don't have to yell.
Light it up, Bob. Do it now. Now! He stares at the two-way. Now? Yes, do it now. We were wrong about their ETA. Do it right now! He drops the radio and fumbles with his lighter and finds himself praying that the antique fuses will work. Bob Stuckey is no atheist. He has his own conception of who God is and how busy the man must be. But right now, as Bob touches the big flame to the end of the safety fuse and the jute sparks to life, he asks if God might perhaps have a moment to do him this one favor. The preacher hears the first explosion coming from behind him as he's standing on the RV's running board. A surreal version of Washington crossing the Delaware. His red-stained face, black morning suit, Wellington boots, and cue ball head shining dully in the pre-dawn murk. The night sky flickers above him like a photographer's strobe, and the aftershock thumps against the back of the camper. At first, he ducks instinctively, as though he's being shot at, and then, momentarily vexed, he twists around to gaze back at the Walker horde. He sees the second and third explosions burst the ground open along the outskirts of Carlinville, in the gloomy light appearing as oil gushers sending particles of black earth heavenward in brilliant orange plumes. The vast black spouts blossom into the pale gray sky, kicking up the tail half of the Walker herd like a carpet being rolled up. Jeremiah once saw a real honest-to-goodness twister while doing a tent revival meeting in Arkansas, and it looked a lot like this. Trailer parks, whole communities, entire neighborhoods, seen from a distance, appearing to dissolve and get sucked up into the fury of the tornado. Tiny particles that first appear to be unidentifiable trash or debris turn out to be swing sets, chimneys, entire cars, entire homes. The sight of it makes a person's soul contract inward with primordial unease, Mother Nature throwing one of her nastiest tantrums. And now this abomination, is bringing it all back in one great booming rush. The preacher ducks again as the first projectile lands on the roof of the trailer, a dark, glistening object which bounces off the bonnet and tumbles across the front quarter panel, landing on the running board a few inches from Jeremiah's boots. It gets lodged behind the fender long enough for the preacher to identify it as a severed human hand. Other objects begin raining down on the RV, arms, feet, half a torso, a few ruined decapitated heads, sending particle bombs of blood and tissue down across the windshield so profusely that Reese Lee Hawthorne, who is behind the wheel and struggling to hold the vehicle steady in the storm of carnage, flips on the windshield wipers.
Stay on course,
Jeremiah howls at his driver.
Keep on going.
The preacher then fishes his walkie-talkie out of his suit pocket and throws a quick glance over his shoulder to assess the damage. In the haze of the blasts, he can see the massive tow truck weaving to and fro, the flickering light and the sounds of human agony still pulsing. And beyond that, he can see that a huge portion of the population of biters has been vanquished. The rear half of the swarm either disintegrated by the explosions or scattered across the seared brown earth in lifeless, smoking lumps of flesh. Jeremiah squeezes the walkie-talkie send button and screams into the mouthpiece.
Brother Stephen, don't you dare stop that tow truck! Don't you dare slow down! We still got hundreds of them things marching with us! These people cannot turn back the tide of fate! Don't you even think about stopping!
Jeremiah hears a noise from the front of the caravan and whips around. His eyes narrow with fury.
Cowards!
Bob Stuckey peers over the top of the overturned coal car and sees something horrible developing in the distant dark reaches of the tunnel. He'd been crouching behind the wrecked conveyance for the last 5 minutes, first watching the fuse sparkle and spit and wend its way along the ground to the dynamite, and then ducking down behind the car with each thunderous roar as the sodium carbonate and nitroglycerin did their jobs. But now, the aftershocks have started creaking through the bones of the ancient mine shaft. Bob turns on his flashlight, shines it down the length of the tunnel from which he has just come, and springs to his feet when he sees the ceiling joists beginning to sift dust down through the darkness 100 yards away. He starts backing away when he sees the sides of the shaft starting to bow inward like warped, surreal Salvador Dali sculptures melting in time-lapse. And he turns and breaks into a trot when the tunnel begins caving in. Miners call it a bounce. When a shaft bounces, the entire topography of the earth changes. Streams alter their course, boulders crack, and entire tectonic plates shift slightly. Bob hustles along for about a minute, heading back toward the Elkins Creek main branch in the Woodbury sewers. But when he hears the thunderous low rumbling rising, he glances back over his shoulder, aiming the flashlight beam at the depths behind him. The leading edge of the cave-in has closed the distance to about 100 feet, and it's gaining. The entire mine system is collapsing behind Bob, and within seconds will reach him and devour him and bury him in the cold, black, eternal void, and that'll be all she wrote. This gets Bob moving in a dead run, which isn't easy in such a narrow, confined space. He bangs and scrapes against the fossilized surfaces of the walls. He charges westward. The cave-in gains on him, practically nipping at his heels. He reaches the underside of the creek just as the tributaries on either side of him fold. The noise is immense, like a series of depth charges at the bottom of the ocean, and it makes Bob quicken his pace. Now he's hurtling as fast as his poor old legs will carry him, sucking dusty air into his lungs, the tidal wave of blackness pushing up behind him, swallowing everything in its path. He gasps and flails and sprints down the main conduit while the flashlight beam bounces chaotically across the ceiling and walls, and the weight of the encroaching collapse, now right behind him, presses in on him. The noise deafens him and threatens to drag him down. He drops the flashlight. He charges through absolute darkness for another eternal moment of agonizing terror before his knees buckle. He trips and falls, sprawling face first, sliding for a few yards in the cinders. He bangs against the corner of 2 intersection tunnels, and then lies still, waiting for the cold, dark, final curtain to draw down over him. Chapter 17.
Come on, baby, it's now or never. Do it!
The sound of Molly Fraser's voice from the Winnebago's passenger seat girds the driver, and he shoots a feverish glance over at his wife, nods, and then yanks the wheel. The RV sends up a shriek as it skids into a sharp turn, then roars down the narrow dirt road that disappears into the forest. James Fraser's had enough. He's not going to fight some insane war against people he doesn't even know, using walkers as weapons, alongside some preacher who seems to have lost his mind. Hands welded to the steering wheel with the tightness of a vice, James can see in the mirror the foliage and limbs scraping the sides of the camper. He can also see the rest of the convoy behind him in disarray, some of the other vehicles pulling away and making a break for it in the opposite direction. Thank the Lord he's not the only one. The young, sandy-haired man with the kind eyes and scraggly beard has been debating with his wife for over 24 hours now about whether they should stay with the preacher or slip away, as so many others have already done. James and Molly Fraser both come from Pentecostal church backgrounds with extremely conservative, strict parents and overbearing fathers. They never truly clicked with Father Murphy. Too liberal, too Catholic, too ethnic, too something. But it was better than struggling on their own. They needed the familiar security of church people, no matter the denomination. But when Jeremiah Garlitz came along, the Frasers, and many others for that matter, saw a kindred spirit, a man from their world, a leader who spoke their language. This is the saddest part of this whole mess to James Fraser. What they could have had if Reverend Garlitz had kept his wits about him. They could have had the peace and satisfaction of not just surviving the plague, but truly living in the Holy Spirit. Now, as the pale pre-dawn light starts to bruise the shadows of the forest along Elkins Creek, and James steers the camper toward the farmland to the north, both he and his wife sit in the desolate silence of the RV's cab, unsure of what sins they're committing by fleeing the caravan, or what fate has in store for them up north. Bob Stuckey opens his eyes. He lies in darkness, a cold weight pressing down on his legs. But he realizes, with some measure of pleasant surprise, that he's still breathing. A faint glint of light is visible out of the corner of his eye, and he has to twist around into an awkward position in order to see that his flashlight has fallen and rolled about 30 feet away, and now lies on the tunnel floor, shining off an adjacent wall. Bob takes deep breaths and rises to a kneeling position, his joints screaming with pain and stiffness. His greasy black hair hangs in his face. He wipes it back and shakes off the dizziness and looks around the dark, crisscrossing tunnels, the ancient joists above him dripping with condensation and whiskers of roots. He quickly pieces together what just happened. The cave-in must have run its course to the point that the wave bumped up against the reinforcing beams and stonework of the intersecting tunnels. He looks down and sees the shards of plastic and electrical guts of his two-way radio. He must have fallen on the device in all the excitement and smashed the thing to pieces. His pulse races, a cold rivulet of panic traveling down the pathways of his spine. Shit, he mumbles as he struggles to his feet, his ribs stitched with pain where he smashed into the wall. Time continues ticking away. He's not sure how long he's been lying incapacitated here, and now there's no way of keeping in touch with Lily. He has a feeling the dynamite blasts were too little too late. Something about the urgency in Lily's voice, the rumbling overhead. Now that batshit crazy preacher could already be attacking. Bob goes over and snatches up the flashlight, and then starts trotting down the central conduit, heading back toward town as fast as his battered old bones will allow. His side starts aching immediately, but he ignores it. He picks up his speed. The flashlight beam bounces ahead of him. He has no way of gauging how far away he is or how long it will take him to get back home. The long main branch that connects Woodbury with Elkins Creek goes on for almost 3 miles and has a sameness to it. A regularity of ceiling slats and congealed hardpack walls and intermittent dead cage lights hanging down on antique cables. He looks for a milestone as he lopes along, huffing and puffing laboriously, his .357 banging on his hip. He looks for a sign he's closing in on the home tunnels. but the gray rotting walls and calcium deposits and random discarded tools pass in a blur. He picks up his pace. His heart hammers against his chest. He knows he's already put a mile or two between him and Elkins Creek, but how long will it take to cover the remaining mile or so? The dry silver oval of light dances across the darkness ahead of him, illuminating more and more of the depths of the mine shaft. He feels like a rat in a maze. He thinks of Lily and David Stern and Harold and that poor hapless gal Norma and that kid Miles trying to hold off the preacher's army of sycophants. He thinks of those children locked up in the station house with Barbara. He runs faster. It takes him a while to realize that his chest has started to pang and that his huffing and puffing has deteriorated into painful wheezing. Again, he ignores it. He keeps charging along as swiftly as possible, leaping over wrecked coal cars and errant detritus from generations of runaway slaves, miners, and undocumented fugitives. The tunnel seems to stretch away from him, a telescope turned backward, a dream in which he can't get anywhere no matter how hard he runs. His chest throbs with pain, the pressure squeezing in on it now. His neck gets stiff. His left arm twinges with knifing jolts, his joint seize up. He slows down slightly, and then he gets mad and runs harder. The light beam bounces. The walls blur. He gasps for breath. He's getting dizzy. His ears, deafened by the blasts, can now hear only the syncopated drumbeat of his huffing breaths. His jaw begins to ache. Pain shoots down his arms. He slows to a hobble, holding the flashlight with one sweaty hand, the other hand now on his belly. Nausea churns in his gut. It feels as though a metal band is tightening around his chest. The back of his throat burns, flaring molten hot with each breath. He moves his free hand up to his sternum, where it feels like an elephant is standing on his chest between his pectorals. His hobbling slows to an awkward trundle as he hunches in pain. The vomit comes up without warning, retching out of him on a watery, garbled yawn, spattering the front of his filthy chambray shirt and his clodhoppers. There's not much in his stomach, so the puke isn't very productive, but it's noisy and slows him down to a stagger. He finally stops and leans down and puts his hands on his knees. He's soaked in perspiration, and his sweat has gone icy cold and clammy. He drops the flashlight. The pressure on his chest is immense now, 1,000-ton headstone weighing down on his heart. His heart. His goddamn heart. He falls to his knees, holds his chest. His situation registers in stages. First, he can think only of Lily and the others, and how he has to simply work through this momentary delay, because he knows better than most that a boatload of other causes can bring on symptoms that merely resemble a heart attack. That's when the vertigo and breathlessness pour over him and drag him down. He collapses, still holding himself, heaving and gasping ragged breaths off the tunnel floor, the puffs blowing up little clouds of black dust. The second stage of his realization comes to him then on a tide of white-hot anger.
You idiot. You fool, you're supposed to be a man of medicine, and now look at you. Look at you. At the worst possible moment. All the careless living finally catches up to you.
All the booze and late nights and cigarettes and red-eye gravy and grits dripping with butter and bacon grease and fried chicken and banana cream pie, all the punishments he doled out to his heart over the years, were coming home to roost. Flopping onto his back in a sudden paroxysm of agony, the sharp pain slicing a chasm down through the center of his chest, he hugs himself and gasps for air. He stares at the ceiling through tears. His lungs heave for air that comes only stubbornly. His flesh crawls. The third and final revelation comes then on a wave of despair. This is the big one. The heart attack his doctor back in Augusta had been warning him about for decades, and it couldn't have come at a worse time. A tear breaks out of the corner of one eye and tracks down the left side of his face. He stares at the wormy, tangled convolutions of the tunnel ceiling and the dim, angular beam of the fallen flashlight, and feels the fist close around his heart, and the concrete filling his lungs and halting his blood flow, and everything going all fuzzy and soft focus on him. He knows what comes next, and he thinks about not being able to ever see Lily again, not being able to fight alongside her, not being able to see her glittering hazel eyes taking in the strange circus the world has become. All this passes through his mind in a millisecond that feels like an eternity. He thinks of the kids. He thinks of holding the little Dupree boy, Lucas, on his knee a couple of days ago, playing "This Is the Way the Gentlemen Ride," and getting a magnificent giggle out of the child, and for some reason feeling an enormous and unexpected sense of accomplishment. Just to get that giggle in these dark times is a salve on the soul. Bob never married, never knew what it was like to have children, but he loved kids, and he adored these little ragamuffins that Lily and he had taken in after Woodbury's fall. He loved the Slocum twins, their elfin faces reminding him of two little marzipan dolls, the way their eyes twinkled when Bob showed them a 4-leaf clover he found on a supply run last week. These children represent the hope to someday restore the world to the way it was, and they mean everything to Bob. And now, lying in the throes of cardiac arrest, he thinks of the preacher and his bug-fuck crazies getting their hands on these kids. He thinks of these children in the line of fire. He thinks of them being in grave danger this very instant. Bob starts to crawl, his left arm completely numb, his legs worthless, his lungs on fire. He makes it a few inches before collapsing. He breathes through his nose, puffing little blooms of cinder dust. He starts again, dragging his failing body along with agonizing slowness, a few centimeters at a time. It feels as though his chest is about to rupture. He breathes in steel wool, but refuses to give in to the pain. He keeps crawling, and keeps his hot gaze locked on the unforgiving darkness ahead of him. The eastern horizon goes from a deep cobalt blue to a washed-out gray, the first light of day pushing back the shadows in the woods around Woodbury. The air snaps with the chill of early morning and the whir of the aviary as a dark figure emerges from a hole in the ground, hastens across a clearing, and climbs the nearest live oak. The butcher birds in the high branches screech their bloodthirsty shrieks as a greeting, or maybe a warning, as the figure finds a vantage point and digs in a pocket for a pair of binoculars. Dressed in his threadbare hoodie, his delicate braids flagging in the breeze, Miles Littleton hooks an arm around the tree's center trunk to steady himself as he scans the barrens out beyond the tobacco fields. Through the lenses, he can see a narrow panorama of derelict farmhouses, wreckage-strewn 2 lanes, and dry riverbeds dissecting the Georgia hinterlands like the desiccated veins of a vast corpse. He sees the tinsel shimmer of the Flint River snaking southward in the new light. He blinks. About 2.5 miles away, a low thunderhead of dust rises off Cove Road. He blinks again. He adjusts the focus and gapes at the massive inkblot of vehicles and the myriad shadows fanning out in their wake, coming this way, moving with the slow certainty of a black glacier. "Fuck me," Miles mutters, and lets the binoculars dangle and bounce around his neck as he climbs back down in a hurry. He hits the ground and charges back across the clearing to the manhole cover. He lifts it, then lowers himself down through the breach. Footsteps converge on him as soon as he drops to the tunnel floor. "Well?" Lily's voice crackles with tension, her fists clenching involuntarily as she stands before him in her camo jacket, her hair pulled back taut in a ponytail. She has a bandolier belt slung across her chest, the row of fully jacketed bullets nestled between her small breasts. Miles gives her a grave look. "They've already crossed the Flint." "Fuck." Lily swallows dryly and looks around the room at the others gathering behind her. Harold Staubach holds a 12-gauge against his hip, his russet-brown face shiny with sweat. David Stern stands behind him in the shadows, his AR-15 slung over the shoulder of his silk roadie jacket. Norma Sutters comes trundling up behind David, her plump features coalescing into a frown. "Gonna be blowing in here in like maybe half an hour? Something like that?" Okay. "All right." Lily swallows hard again, focusing with laser intensity on the task at hand. Looking down the length of the main tunnel. Less than 100 feet away from her, the passageway plunges into darkness. They've been trying to conserve power and light bulbs by burning only the absolute minimum number of cage lights. Now Lily walks over to the wall and flips the switches Bob installed as a safety measure a few days ago. "Here's what I need. I need everybody to listen closely because I only got time to go through this once. The others get very still as the cage lights flare on, one after another, down the length of the main conduit, past the makeshift nursery with its fleet of cribs and cots, past the side tunnels, past the temporary infirmary in the storage room, and out beyond the far chain-link barriers. Norma, I'm going to need you to go get the dummies. Bring them back here on the double, as many as we have. It'll have to be enough. Miles, you help her. Norma and Miles hustle down the center aisle tunnel toward the storage room. David and Harold, I'm going to need you guys to go ahead and set that safe zone up as quickly as you can. Then take your places and get into character. David Stern looks pained, panicky. Lily, we're going to need more than 2 guys. You'll have Miles and Norma too as soon as we're ready down here. And Bob when he gets back. She remembers that Bob is late, which is a bad sign. And she pushes the dread from her mind. If all goes well, Tommy and I will be able to join you soon enough. How the hell is anybody going to find us? Look, we got 3 working walkie-talkies, right? You take one, I'll have one, and I'll give one to Norma. 3 teams. Harold and you, Norma and Miles, me and Tommy. But what about Babs? What about her? David wipes his mouth. That station house is really exposed out there. I don't know. Seems like we could have found a safer place. There's nothing we can do about it now. Come on, let's get to work. While we're young! Lily claps her hands briskly and the group scatters. Lily rushes across the lounge area and starts rearranging chairs. David and Harold head toward the sewer entrance 50 feet away. They vanish around the corner, and their footsteps recede into the dripping silence. By this point, Norma and Miles have returned with the first pair of dummies. Norma speaks quickly, tersely, almost under her breath. Had enough clothes from the Salvation Army drop to make 5 of these things, but we're going to have to go back there for more if we want to make all of us up all raggedy ass. She drags an effigy across the floor and drops it on a chair. They're pretty rough, but from a distance, I don't know. Like my mama used to say, on a galloping horse, you don't look half bad, baby girl. Garbed in rags and hand-me-downs, the dummies are filled with old newspaper and trash, the faces hewn from pairs of nude-colored pantyhose stuffed with more paper. They look like the kind of objects a group of protesters might burn during a demonstration. Them walkers are pretty fucking stupid, Miles ventures, setting a dummy on a chair. But I wonder if they're stupid enough to buy this. They'll buy it, Lily says. Trust me. Come on, let's get the others in here. A minute later, they have 5 of the effigies sitting in formation around the lounge. It's a surreal sight, even for this place. And Lily stares at the things for a moment before she looks at Norma and Miles. Okay, one last thing before I cut you guys loose. Norma looks at her. What's that, child? Lily has already unbuckled her belt and unsnapped her jeans. Pee on them with me. For a moment, Norma looks at Miles, who looks back at Norma, then looks aghast at Lily. Come on! Lily pulls her pants down, shoves off her panties, and hovers over the lap of the first dummy. Pee on them. David Stern and Harold Staubach find the Dromedary Street manhole only minutes after they turn the corner beneath the intersection of Dromedary and Date Lane. The air hangs thick with a fog of methane and ammonia stench, and they have to wade through 6 inches of brackish mire in order to reach the exit point. They can see thin beams of the day's first glimmer of sunlight slicing down through the seams of the ancient manhole, celestial rays of light piercing the moats and demarcating the sewer's egress. Neither man says a word as they reach the bottom of the embedded stone steps. Working quickly and silently, David helps Harold up the steps first, then follows with his assault rifle dangling and twisting on its strap. The older man struggles for a moment with the rusty cover, but eventually manages to force it open a few inches, wide enough to let in an enormous rush of acrid, reeking walker stench. Harold pulls a small mirror from behind his belt and sticks it up into the daylight. Bob Stuckey procured a dozen of these small make-up mirrors earlier in the month from the ruins of the town drugstore, and they have been invaluable to the tunnel dwellers. Now Harold Staubach probes the mirror far enough to see a reflection of the street corner. In the small oval of glass, scores of walkers are visible milling about the central intersection. To the left, a row of boarded storefronts overlooks a sidewalk riddled with the dead. Some of them continually brush against each other, while others idle in slumped, stationary positions in front of jagged, broken windows, drooling black bile from their liver-colored lips as though waiting for their reflection to deliver some imminent message. Harold rotates the mirror 45 degrees to the left until they can see their destination. Beyond the walker-infested street corner, a half a block north, two enormous semi-trucks sit facing each other across the massive town entrance. Harold's heart rate kicks up a few notches. He can see the vacant lot adjacent to the gate, a square acre of wild, overgrown prairie grass littered here and there with overturned oil drums, discarded tires, and human remains, all but picked clean by birds and weather and the ravenous dead. Some of the skeletons are so sun-bleached they look almost white. But other than these macabre reminders of the plague, the lot is fairly clear of walkers. "You ready for this, my friend?" Harold asks somewhat rhetorically. No response from David. "We've been as quiet as mice for like 1,000,000 hours now. When do we get to talk?" The voice, as soft as the coo of a little bird, but also full of righteous indignation, penetrates Barbara Stern's racing thoughts and makes her whirl away from the window with a start. In the dim light of dawn, which seeps through the cracks of the boarded windows, Barbara sees little Mercy Slocum standing directly behind her, hands on her hips in an elfin impression of long-suffering annoyance. The girl's frowning, cherubic face has chocolate stains on it. Barbara broke out the last of the stale candy bars 20 minutes ago, and they were gone in seconds. The walkie-talkie was then turned off to prevent the frenzied voices of David and the others from making the kids more nervous than they already were. Now Barbara is resorting to games in order to keep the group as quiet as possible. "Get away from the window, sweetheart," Barbara says gently, shooing the girl back toward the others. "You're going to lose the game." The other children huddled together at the opposite end of the room, standing around a couple of makeshift cots, watching this exchange with keen interest. Their toys and books are strewn across the floor around them. Bethany Dupree, the de facto spokesman for the children, also has her hands on her hips in a melodramatic display of exasperation. "These games are just a trick," she announces. Mercy Slocum shuffles over to her twin sister, and the two of them stand there, facing Barbara in their matching threadbare pinafores, arms crossed sullenly across their little chests as though waiting for an apology. To Barbara, they look like a Diane Arbus photograph, more wraith-like than childlike, as though torn from an album of Dust Bowl American poverty. "You're treating us like babies," Tiffany Slocum weighs in. "We want to know the truth." "Shh." Barbara comes up and kneels before them, speaking very softly and yet forcefully. "The time to be the most quiet is now." "Stop saying that," Lucas Dupree commands, his tiny chin jutting indignantly. "You told us this was a field trip," Bethany says. "That was a lie. And then you told us there's a war coming, but you won't say with who." "Shh." Barbara puts her finger to her lips. "I'll answer your questions only if you promise to whisper." "What's going on?" Bethany demands in a petulant whisper that comes out more like a grunt. "Don't lie because we can tell when you're lying. Kids can always tell. That's something adults will never, ever, ever understand. Kids know. Trust me on that, Mrs. Stern." "Call me Barb." "What's going on? Is it like a walker attack or what?" Barbara lets out a sigh. "Some bad people are coming here to kill us." The children all go very still. Even Lucas Dupree, the youngest of them, only a year or two out of diapers, stares gravely back at Barbara, which pinches Barbara's heart. To see the face of a child looking so sullen, so weary, so grim. Maybe in some ways this is the worst part of the plague, worse than getting devoured by the dead. To see a child devoured by life. At last, Bethany summons up a response. "Is it because they want our stuff?" Barbara shrugs. "I swear to you, sweetheart, I don't know what they want. Revenge? The town itself?" She pauses and looks into the faces of these miniature revenants, as spectral and haunted as ghosts. "They believe God is on their side, which makes them even more dangerous, especially the preacher, Jeremiah." Bethany cocks her head. "You mean that big guy in the black suit?" Nodding glumly, Barbara can't lie anymore. "That's right, sweetie." "That's stupid!" Bethany tries to wrap her brain around this. "He's not a bad man. He showed me a magic trick once. Gave me licorice. He's a good man."
Barbara slowly shakes her head.
"Not so much, honey. Not so much." The little girl starts to say something else when the strangest sound echoes on the wind outside. The sheer incongruity of it silencing her and stiffening each child's spine. Barbara shushes the children one last time. "I want everybody to stay together, stay very still, and stay as quiet as possible until I tell you it's okay." She looks at them as the noise outside rises. Under the rumble of machines, the keening, knife-edge sounds of humans screaming drift across the outskirts of town. "I'm going to go back to the window now, but nobody move." Her binoculars bounce on her chest as Barbara hurries across the room. She stands with her back against the jamb and carefully pushes aside the makeshift shade until a thin wisp of light shines in. She peers through the binoculars, scanning the southeast corner of town. In the long shadows of dawn, about a quarter of a mile away, where Gates Road splits off from Highway 74 and the milky rays of sunlight cant down through the adjacent woods, she can see a thundercloud of dust and exhaust approaching. With one hand, Barbara slowly, instinctively, reaches down to where her revolver is tucked into its holster on the side of her muumuu, her hand caressing the waffled surface of her .44 caliber bulldog's grip. Chapter 18. At precisely 6:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time that morning, in the gelid air and pale blue light of the forest south of Woodbury, without warning or precedent, an outsider with very specific orders enters the town limits on foot from Reeves Road, then creeps under the trees, a heavy pack jangling on his back. He consults a hand-drawn map as he moves silently through the undergrowth, his heavy lumberjack boots snapping twigs and crunching over ancient humus. He finds the red bandana fluttering in the breeze, tied to the tip of a stick thrust into the ground. He turns west and walks about 10 paces, past a pair of softly humming generators camouflaged under skeins of leaves and twigs. A moment later, he locates the manhole cover embedded in the dirt, a relic from earlier in the century when a new sewage system was introduced to the area. He kneels, shrugs off his pack, and takes out his tools. C-clamps go down on the edges of the lid, securing it to the paving stones around the outer ring. He tightens the clamps with channel locks. Then, just to be sure, he moves a small boulder from its mossy home under a nearby tree and sets it down on the manhole cover. A few more stones go on top of the cover, and then, satisfied with his work, he goes searching for the other manhole entrance. 20 minutes later, at exactly 7:13 a.m., 250 yards southeast of the Woodbury train yard, the remaining members of the preacher's convoy boom across the Woodbury town limits in a cyclone of noise and dust and the rising stench of the dead. The tow truck driven by Stephen Pembry is lagged behind a mile or two, awaiting orders, keeping the throngs occupied in an adjacent tobacco field with the mesmerizing intervals of flickering light. Meanwhile, the caravan follows the access road that winds along the edge of the forest, traveling single file until they come to a dry riverbed where a yellow bandana flaps and flags at the apex of yet another stick thrust into the ground. The flag stands near the mouth of a culvert, the gaping maw of which is crisscrossed by rusty, barnacled iron bars. Reese Lee Hawthorne and Stephen Pembry discovered this culvert on one of their reconnaissance trips, and now it will serve the mission well as a backdoor into the tunnels. Jeremiah's RV skids to a stop, the other trucks slamming on their brakes behind him. In the aftermath of the mass exodus that followed James and Molly Frazier's surprise flight from the fold, only a half-dozen vehicles remain, and now these 6 small-duty pickups and flatbed trucks raise a fog bank of fumes, the homemade biodiesel burning dirty, as they scuttle to a halt behind the preacher. By this point, the morning sun has crested the palisades of black oaks along Elkins Creek, and the woods south of town appear almost primordial, with celestial sunbeams cutting down through the motes of cottonwood and insects that teem in the chill air. God has bestowed a beautiful day for a reckoning. And adding to all of the preacher's euphoria and good fortune is the fact that the immediate area is far enough away from the tunnel entrance for him and his followers to remain unheard and undetected by the heathens underground. The RV's cab doors squeal open, and the preacher hops out one side, Riesly Hawthorne out the other. The preacher's gleaming bald pate shimmers in the shafts of light filtering through the trees, his black coattails flapping in the wind as he pulls his walkie-talkie out and presses the switch. "Brother Gleason, talk to me." Through a crackle of static, Chester Gleason's voice squawks out of the device. "It's done. It's done, brother. All them rabbit holes are locked up tight, and I can hear them down there." "Well done, brother." Jeremiah releases the button, his hand shaking in the cold sunlight. His skull feels too big for his scalp. His flesh crawls with adrenaline as he ticks off the to-do list in his head. "All right, next." He turns to the men gathered around him, his disciples, his holy warriors, his wolves. "Lewis, use the winch to pull them bars." One of the men hurries back to his truck, hops in, and throws it in reverse. He backs up to the riverbank, 12 feet away from the culvert opening. Riesly Hawthorne circles around the back of the pickup and disengages the winch hook, pulling the cable across the dry ditch and then hooking the end around the ancient grillwork of bars covering the culvert opening. He gives a signal. The engine revs. Black exhaust spumes from the vertical pipe. The truck lurches, pulling the cable taut. Rear wheels dig into the muck, spinning for a second. The bars creak and groan. Off to the side, the bald preacher watches with voices in his head and the fire of madness in his eyes. The bars finally snap, slamming down on the ground and sliding across the riverbed. Lily Call finishes up making her last-minute adjustments to the tunnel, stuffing bloody bandages from the infirmary into the torsos of the makeshift mannequins, when she feels a slight tremor in the bones of the sewer. A faint temblor that is sensed more than felt, resonating faintly up through the soles of her boots. She stands very still for a moment, cocking her head, listening. The silence seems laden with potential, a tuning fork still vibrating slightly, but not revealing anything specific. She grabs her walkie-talkie off the spool table and squeezes the button. "Miles, can you hear me?" Nothing but static from the other end. Nobody hears the gibberish tumbling out of Jeremiah's mouth as he stands back in the warmth of the morning sun, surveying the cool shadows of the woods around the gaping culvert opening. His voice has a low, musical, and breathless tone as the nonsensical syllables pour out of him, sounding like an approximation of an actual language, but not a real one, more like the patois of a babbling infant possessed by the spirit, pre-verbal, pre-literal. In the Pentecostal Church, it is believed the Holy Spirit enters a person at critical times, and the result is this fluid vocalizing of speech-like syllables, which lacks any connotative meaning or any comprehensible pattern, but are considered by true believers to be sacred speech. Scientists refer to this phenomenon as glossolalia, or the putative speaking of natural languages previously unknown to the speaker. But in Jeremiah's case, it is clear that the tongues being gibbered are those of his father. The garbled scat issuing out of him comes directly from the old man's repertoire, all-pervasive, all-encompassing, all-powerful. "Pardon?" The voice next to him snaps him out of his reverie. "What was that?" "Huh?" Jeremiah turns and looks into the gaunt, gray, deeply lined face of Lewis Packard, his winch operator, as the man puzzles over the sound of the tongues. Jeremiah smiles. "Oh, yes. I was just humming an old hymn, a favorite of mine, the old rugged cross." "Brother Stephen's truck is coming up the hill with the walkers." "That's excellent, Lewis." The gaunt man chews nervously on his cheek. "Brother, you know I'm with you 110%. "What is it, Lewis?"
these people gotta go, and I'm with you till the bitter end."
"What's wrong?" The gaunt man lets out a tense sigh and speaks in a low whisper.
"We're never gonna get them things to go inside them tunnels. Never in a million years."
The preacher just smiles. He can smell the rising tide of death on the breeze as if it were a storm front rolling in. He hears the rumble of Stephen's tow truck, the human scream silent now, the prisoner long ago succumbing to blood loss and exposure. He senses the weight of the throngs coming up through the woods behind the truck, the unholy choir of watery snarling and growling noises rising on the wind. He glances over his shoulder and sees the tow truck materializing around the corner of the forest road, the sea of shadows rolling in behind it in the flickering strobe light. He turns to the others.
"Everybody in your vehicles. Lock the doors."
Then Jeremiah goes over to his RV, snaps the latch on the side door, leans inside, and pulls out a box marked Cox Remote Control Dune Buggy. At last, a voice crackles through the static spewing out of Lily Call's walkie-talkie. Yo, Lily, we're here. We was just dodging a few biters, but I can read you loud and clear. Now go ahead." Lily feels the walls of the tunnel contracting around her like the innards of a living thing reacting to poison in its system, and it makes her stomach clench as she thumbs the switch and says into the mic, "Have you made it to the church yet? Over." "Yes, ma'am. Got the clothes. Now on our way to the safe zone." "Good. Awesome. I gotta get the fuck out of here. I'm getting the wheelies down here all by myself." "Copy that. See you in a few." "Right." Lily whirls and hurries down the length of the main conduit toward the manhole. But even now, as she trots along, she feels the cold fingers of claustrophobia tightening around her neck, stealing her breath, sending cold currents of panic down her spine. Ahead of her, the tunnel seems to blur out of focus, slipping into a double image like motion picture film jumping out of registration. She has dealt with excruciating claustrophobia for most of her life, ever since she accidentally locked herself in a coat closet at her cousin's house in Macon when she was 9 years old. Now, she feels the old prickly panic returning, like cold fingers wrapping around her spine. The tunnel spins. She nearly trips. She slows down and braces herself against the wall. She realizes that she hasn't been in the tunnels alone in a while, maybe ever. It's hard to be sure right now. She blinks, rubs her eyes, tries to ignore the dizziness that's washing over her and to fix her gaze on the steps embedded in the wall at the end of the main conduit. In her bleary line of sight, about 15 feet away, the faint indentations in the crumbling stone wall are apparent, and she edges toward them as fast as she can without falling flat on her face. The vertigo courses over her, threatening to knock her off her feet. She holds onto a brace. It feels as though her head is about to loll off her shoulders and her gorge rises, but she wills herself not to throw up and to keep inching forward. She reaches the steps at the precise same moment she first hears the sound. The faint, far-off noise is so strange and incongruous at this moment in this dark, moldering place that she freezes, her brain like an engine seizing up. She doesn't even look over her shoulder at first. She simply stands there, one hand on the middle rung of the steps, her entire body gripped in glacial, dreamlike paralysis. Something moves at the dark end of the tunnel, glimpsed only peripherally, at first registering as a small animal darting around the corner. She whirls around and sees a small remote-controlled toy rolling toward her. "What the fuck?" she thinks. "Is this part of that?" The closer the toy gets, the more clearly it comes into view. A metal flake orange dune buggy with fat little tires, a tiny whip antenna, and a couple of outboard devices duct-taped to its hood. It sends up a flash of silver strobe light at odd intervals as it rattles closer and closer. But the strangest, and by far worst part, is the recording being played back through a miniature speaker affixed to the toy car's rear bulwark. When she was in college, Lily Call once accidentally stumbled upon a website called comeuppance.com, on which Islamic fundamentalist terrorists posted old clips of people being beheaded and other various and sundry horrors. Before she had the good judgment to quickly navigate away from the visual trash heap, she got a good look at a grainy video of a British journalist being tortured before the shaky lens of a consumer camera. But oddly, it wasn't the sudden and tawdry terror of seeing a human being reduced to a naked, bloody mass of agony, the man hanging upside down from a meat hook as he's whipped and scourged with barbed wire, that disturbed Lily the most. It was the sound. The terrible, indelible screaming noises that were coming off the little YouTube clip. You can't fake the sound of human suffering, especially at this intensity. No actor in any horror film can approximate the true texture of a tortured shriek. The quality of sound is so specific, so harsh and shrill, as to be almost feral in its timbre. The clamor has an unmistakable electric shock effect on the human ear. Lily hears this very sound coming out of a miniature speaker on board that toy, accompanied by the rising odors of dead flesh wafting through the tunnel. But it's the noise that holds her rapt as the contraption wheels toward her. She stares and stares as the little thing seems to aim itself directly at her feet. The dune buggy bumps into the toe of her boot and bounces back slightly. Lily stares, transfixed, as the thing bumps her again and again, thumping against the steel toe of her work boot as though trying to plow through her. At this close proximity, Lily can see the tiny pencil-thin camera taped to the buggy's hood. The radio signals causing the thing to back up, jack its wheels, and make an attempt to go around her. She snaps out of her fear spell then, and gives the thing a hard kick, sending it into a sideways roll. The toy car smashes against the tunnel wall and breaks apart into shards of plastic and rubber, the camera strobe hanging by a thread, but continuing to blink. That's when Lily sees the shadows at the opposite end of the tunnel, formed by a single yellow cage light dangling down somewhere in the side tunnel, the shapes creeping across the earthen floor like puddles of black ink slowly but inexorably spreading. She sucks in a tense breath when she sees the first biter coming around the corner. For a terrible moment, Lily remains motionless, horror-stricken, almost morbidly fascinated by this catastrophic breach of the area that was only minutes ago living space. The lead corpse appears to be a former businessman, maybe a salesman, perhaps middle-aged at the time of death, now clad in a tattered seersucker suit so worn and stained with bile it looks like butcher paper. Its bloodless face puckers with hunger as it comes down the tunnel toward Lily, at a fairly rapid pace for a walker, the others following on its heels, shuffling along with troubling velocity. There's a female in sun-bleached gingham, maybe at one time a farmer's wife, and a couple of teenage children in gore-encrusted overalls, most likely farm kids. Within seconds, there are too many to process at a single glance. 20, 100. Lily quickly loses count. The tunnel fills with a guttural, watery clatter of putrid vocal cords. The lead creature closes the distance between him and Lily to 50 feet, the others brushing and scraping against the walls behind him, the stench so thick now Lily feels as though she might throw up after all, except that she has no time for such frivolities as vomiting. She scuttles up the embedded steps to the underside of the manhole cover and tries to push the lid open. The thing won't budge. The monsters are closing in. She shoves harder against the bottom of the cover, the clamps on the lid holding tight. The former salesman is now 30 feet away and closing. Some of the other creatures have meandered toward the lounge area, where the urine-soaked effigies sit in a macabre tableau around the spool table. But the half-dozen or so creatures in the lead have locked onto Lily's scent and come toward her in a blur of clenching teeth and palpitating jaws and arms stiff with rigor mortis reaching blindly for her tender flesh. She frantically pushes against the stubborn manhole cover until her fingers throb with pain and her arms twinge, all to no avail. The salesman reaches the bottom of the steps, coming to within 3 feet of Lily's boot soles, and now she's forced to make some instantaneous choices and calculations. She has one extra 10-round ammo magazine wedged behind her belt and one .22 caliber Ruger on her hip, sheathed in leather and with 10 rounds in the grip. She also has a 12-inch buck knife on her other hip for close-quarter confrontations. In one awkward motion, She holds fast to the top rung with her free hand and quickly draws the Ruger with the other. She squeezes off a single blast into the top of the salesman's skull. The pop sets off the tinnitus in her ears, and the backsplash of oily matter makes her flinch, as a rosette of bone and tissue in the top of the creature's head shuts off his reanimated nervous system. More of the creatures clamber toward her. She aims the gun at the manhole cover, shields her face, and blindly fires point blank at the outer edges of the iron. The blast makes her jump. The ricochet sings past her face, hot spit on her cheek, ears deadened further. No good. Waste of bullets. Now what? Think. Her mind goes as blank as a television screen at the end of the programming day. White noise. The plague has had a strange and somewhat unexpected winnowing effect on people. Traits that were once considered flaws, even personality disorders, now help a person survive. Paranoia, narcissism, impulsiveness, greed, sociopathy, even cruelty now become assets. Indeed, the one cross that Lily Call is always borne in the old world has proven to be a rarity among the survivor class, and perhaps has enabled her to emerge as a leader. Call it pathological persistence. Even now, with the discovery of the locked manhole, followed by her mind going blank, Lily refuses to allow a scintilla of doubt to enter her mindscape. She hears the dissonant chorus of phlegm-clogged snarling and the clacking of teeth, and she doesn't even have to look. Out of the corner of her eye, she can see dead things pressing in on her. Dozens of them. Males in bile-stained dungarees, females dragging useless mangled limbs, grotesque former children chewing at the air, and assorted senior citizens, now reduced to emaciated bags of brittle bones and weathered flesh stretched taut like visqueen. The gruesome party has Lily on its radar now, and the partygoers want their hors d'oeuvres. Hopping to the floor of the tunnel, she bangs into a gangly male before the thing can bite and knocks it back on its heels into 3 others, all of whom go down like bowling pins. More move in, and Lily kicks at them as they lunge at her, one at a time, doubling them over, sending them to the floor. She shoots a younger female in the head, turning its face to pulp as it lurches at her. Blood spatters Lily's face as she backs deeper into the tunnel, counting bullets. 3 down, 7 to go in the gun, 10 behind her belt. She's going to need all the ammo she can conserve. More and more biters pour into the tunnel, a slow-motion stampede coming around the far corner in all shapes and sizes, flowing toward Lily with the certainty of a rising tide as she coughs and gags and flinches at the terrible odor. The stench is incredible, so powerful and thick that she can feel it on her skin as she continues to back into the darkness. She reaches down and draws the buck knife from its hip sheath. She brings it up just in time. A younger male with parchment-brown skin shrink-wrapped around its skeletal face suddenly pounces at her, mouth gaping, black gums filled with slimy teeth. She thrusts the knife at it. The roof of its mouth impales itself on the point of the curved blade. Lily swings the male into 2 females, and the former young women stagger and fall backward over their clumsy feet. Lily shoves the male, its mouth still engaged with the knife like a fish on a hook, back in the other direction, slamming it into 2 other males lumbering toward her. The impaled creature shudders backward, knocking the others over. But then things go from bad to worse, as the knife finally slices up through the thing's putrefied nasal cavity, and the skull opens up. The knife pops out the top, and the creature's head cracks apart, coconut-like, into halves, each fragment tumbling to the floor. A geyser of tarry fluids gush out of the thing for a moment, the lack of blood pressure causing the blood to ooze more than spray, as the headless creature remains upright for a single, horrible moment. "Die already!" Lily slashes at the air in front of the headless thing as it finally sags to the floor. Others instantly move in to take its place. Lily keeps slashing and screaming and slowly backing deeper into the labyrinth. David Stern had been in the process of naming these side tunnels, and the one Lily is backing toward now is called Tributary B, a narrow channel of hard-packed earth that connects the deeper maze of zinc mines to the town sewer. Lily realizes if she can make it to the chain-link barrier drawn across its opening and maybe get the thing open quickly enough, she can escape. More biters move in, a cross-section of ages and genders, most of them slimy with mold and sun-bleached, too many for hand-to-hand combat. Lily fires off 6 more shots in quick succession. Brain matter spumes and splatters the tunnel walls all around her, bodies collapsing to the floor, one by one making watery splats. Lily has spent almost a year practicing her aim, ever since Josh Hamilton had taught her how to quick draw and hit moving targets, and she's gotten pretty good at it, better than most. But now she sees the far end of the tunnel. The makeshift infirmary and the lounge with its pea-soaked effigies and the dining area with all its broken crockery and the storage nooks, completely overrun with monsters. They squeeze elbow to elbow into every square foot of space, pressing up against the walls, faces mashing against one another in a macabre, twisted corruption of a subway at rush hour. The horrible sight of it weighs down on Lily so heavily that she doesn't notice the next wave of assailants lunging at her until it's too late. A former obese woman, now with flaccid drapes of flesh hanging off her like excess dress fabric, manages with her hooked claw of a hand to snag a piece of Lily's sweatshirt. Lily rears back and fires. The bullet misses the top of the fat lady's head by a mile and goes into the ceiling. More biters close in. Lily fires again. The gun clicks empty. Fuck! Fumbling awkwardly with the gun, ejecting the clip, fishing for the fresh magazine, trying to get it into the hilt, hands oily with fear sweat, more creatures coming at her, slamming the magazine home, cold dead fingers reaching for her, cocking the slide, teeth chattering inches away from the exposed flesh of her hands and arms. She makes a tactical error. It's an honest mistake. Anybody could have made it. She shoots a quick glance over her shoulder to see how close she is to the tributary. The change in the center of balance is just enough to throw off her equilibrium, and she stumbles over her feet. She feels herself falling. Again, she compensates too severely by clawing at the wall for a handhold, a brace, or a board, or something to stop her fall, and in the process, the gun slips from her grip. She collapses onto the small of her back, the Ruger skittering off across the floor. Chapter 19. All at once, everything slows down, and the ringing in Lily's ears drowns out every other sound, and the pain bolts up her spine and seizes her arms and legs. She tries to scoot away from the onslaught, but now an enormous male moves in on her. A former farmhand in blood-soaked work pants, its shirt torn in half, revealing sagging pectorals the color of earthworms, it pounces on her legs. Lily wriggles under its dead weight trying to get to her knife, but the thing has her pinned to the floor, and the creature's mottled face is folding open like a clamshell, exposing rows of greasy, moldering incisors, which gnash and clack noisily as they close in on her throat. Lily manages to get her hands around its head. For a moment, she prevents it from devouring her, holding it at arm's length. Over the course of that terrible instant, holding that snapping turtle of a head, engulfed in the odor of its hellish spore, a mixture of rotting meat and that inimitable lower note of oily, black death stench, Lily looks into the thing's eyes. Just for a split second, she registers something glinting behind the dead, shark-like cataracts. Cruelty? Madness? Rage? Agony? Maybe all of those things shimmer for a moment behind the creature's gaze as it regards its human food. But then, something breaks the spell. Lily feels a breathy puff of noxious wind on the side of her face, clammy and fetid, and she realizes she's lying right next to the chain-link barrier stretched across the tributary tunnel. The thing on top of her snarls and drools as it looms closer and closer to her neck. Her strength dwindling, Lily takes one last, heartbreaking glance at the narrow tunnel behind that chain-link barrier. She can see the passageway stretching back into the dark void, a single pool of yellow light from a solitary cage lamp hanging down, and she realizes it might as well be 1,000,000 miles away. She realizes she has no more options. She has no more tricks up her sleeve. She feels her strength draining away. For the first time in her life, she realizes it's time to give up. More creatures close in, at least a dozen of them, mostly males, a few ravenous shells of older women, one gruesome child with half of its face torn open and leaking gristle and teeth, come at her from all sides. She feels the shuddering, drooling, wiggling head in her hands begin to slip out of her grip. Einstein said time is relative, and anyone who has been unlucky enough to be engulfed by these hellish creatures knows the tenuous connection between the passage of time and the human mind under great stress. People in car wrecks see every detail in the split second before impact. Soldiers on the battlefield have reported witnessing the very bullets that put them in wheelchairs hanging in the air like moths before striking them. Lily experiences something similar in the suspended beat of time before the first set of teeth sink into the tender flesh of her neck. She closes her eyes, and she half expects her entire life to flicker across her mind screen in some extravagant Cecil B. DeMille montage of her childhood. Maybe a series of gauzy images beginning with her nursery in that airless little knotty pine room in the rear of the Alton Street house. From there, we go to her first-grade class picture in Hastings Park down by the river, her boyfriends, her milestone moments, and maybe even her high school graduation with her father, Everett, proudly carrying around her motorboard hat and her little mimeograph diploma as though they were the Nobel Prize. Part of her longs for this kind of storybook closure, but of course none of it appears to her. And now she sees only the minuscule red cinders down in the center of a monster's eyes burning into her retinas, floating across the dark field of her vision as the air fills with the infernal noise of garbled snarling, and she feels the cold breath of her assailant as its head finally slips through her sweaty fingers. She holds her breath, waiting for the teeth to plunge into her, when suddenly she hears a loud bang. Her eyes pop open at precisely the same moment that the head above her explodes. To the trained ear, the blast of a .357 Magnum, especially in the confines of a narrow subterranean tunnel, makes an unmistakable roar. Deeper and more thunderous than the sound produced by smaller handguns, loud enough to puncture eardrums, the sonic boom rings out as if a giant wrecking ball had slammed through the biter on top of Lily. In accompaniment with the echo of the gunshot, fluids and brain matter erupt in all directions. Lily flinches as a wet spattering of blood splashes into her face, while the rest of the skull and rancid brain matter are blown sideways across the tunnel, hitting the opposite wall with a splat. The body stiffens for a moment before collapsing on top of Lily, the lifeless weight pressing down on her so hard it knocks the wind from her lungs. She frantically looks around, trying to grasp the import of what just happened, but the blood of the headless lump is now flowing out all over her, and she can't breathe, and she sees something out of the corner of her eye. A series of 3 more flashes, like sparks of magnesium flaring in the dark, touched off by a firing pin, flicker in the shadows of the tributary. 3 more biters go down around Lily while she tries to wriggle out from under the weight of the massive corpse pressing upon her. 3 more heads blown apart by large-caliber bullets, spraying brain mist against the opposite wall and sending body after body deflating onto the floor. In some far-flung compartment in Lily's traumatized brain, she registers the fact that only hollow-point bullets could do this kind of damage, the projectiles expanding on impact, sending battering rams through mortified brains. And in a deeper compartment, Lily realizes there's only one person around here that she knows of who uses these soft-point dum-dums. Suddenly, she sees 2 things in her peripheral vision that get her up and moving. The shadow of a human being to her left, behind the chain-link barrier, crawling toward her, and her pistol, the .22 caliber Ruger, with its fresh magazine of 10 rounds, lying 10 feet away on the tunnel floor. She moves quickly, before the next wave of biters can swarm her, and lunges across the tunnel. She grabs the pistol and jacks the slide and spins and squeezes off 4 quick blasts into the heads of approaching biters. Pink mist flashes in the darkness, more tissue spraying the adjacent wall, and 3 of the closest walkers collapse in flaccid heaps on the floor. By this point, the single shadowy figure in the tributary has managed to crawl the remaining 15 feet or so to the cyclone fence barrier, and now this unidentified man begins to fumble with the cable ties on its outside edges that secure the screen to the tunnel opening. The man seems to be injured or otherwise incapacitated, his hands clumsy on the knotted cables. "Bob?" Lily lunges toward the barrier as it shivers and quakes in Bob Stuckey's oily hands. The cable finally breaks loose, and the chain-link section collapses outward onto Bob. "Bob!" The impact knocks him backward. He trips and falls onto his spine, the rusty chain link pressing down on him. He lies there in a supine position, trying to breathe, trying to speak, his eyes bugging in agony. His flesh is pasty white, his eyes rimmed in livid purple, his lips gray and bloodless. His lungs heave, expanding and contracting under his filthy blood-soaked chambray shirt with the urgency of a bellows fanning a dying fire. Lily slips through the opening and pulls the barrier off the older man. A swarm of about 12 new walkers converges on the gaping maw behind Lily as she frantically lifts the barrier up and hurriedly slams it back in place, securing it with the cables. A few of the creatures try to force their way out, pushing on the chain link before the barrier is secured. Grunting and groaning with effort, Lily lets out a howl of rage as she struggles with the cables, her hands greasy with sweat, the creatures pushing up against her, their dead fingers trying to worm their way through the open links. She finally gets the cables wound tight. The pressure of the swarm strains the fencing, bowing the chain link inward, but the cables hold. Lily flops down beside Bob. She pulls him into a furious embrace, smelling his trademark scent: Marlboros, sweat, juicy fruit, and Old Spice. She cradles his head to her collarbone and strokes his hair and softly murmurs, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Cut that one real close. Too close. I thought you were a goner, you old geezer. God, it's good to see. Thank you. He hasn't said a word. She can feel his chest palpating. His skin is cold and clammy. His shirt is soaked through with sweat. Lily backs off an inch or two and takes a closer look at Bob's face, which is draped in shadows from the meager cone of light above them, and that's when she starts panicking. She can see by the color of his skin, the way his eyes have gone pink and glassy, the way his nostrils flare and his lungs heave as he tries to speak but is able to make only strangled grunting noises, that he's having some kind of seizure or attack. The word heart bubbles up from the deeper pools of Lily's unconscious. She saw her Uncle Mike have one years ago, before her very eyes at the kitchen table at Grandpa Buck's place in Valdosta. The heavy-set house painter was Everett's older brother, and had spent a lifetime of catting around and drinking heavily and sampling every form of fatty food and fast women that life had to offer. Divorced 3 times, a parolee from the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta for wire fraud, Uncle Mike surprised no one when he bowed his head that night at the dining table, like he was either praying or about to take a header into his collard greens. The strangest part, especially to a 17-year-old girl, was the casual way he looked up and said, "Oops, here comes," like he was expecting a package or a court summons. And everybody around the table knew what he was talking about, and everybody knew what it entailed. Nobody panicked. Nobody rushed to the telephone. In fact, they immediately got into an argument regarding what vehicle they should deploy to take him to the hospital. Lily remembers waiting for the man to clutch his chest dramatically and flop onto his back in seizures of agony like in the movies. But that never happened. Uncle Mike might as well have had a gas bubble that night that he needed to simply belch out. In fact, Lily had learned later that this was exactly what a heart attack felt like. At first. That night, before they took Mike Hall away, Lily saw her dad's brother writhing in pain on the couch out in the living room, complaining that it felt like an iron vice was tightening around his chest. Lily remembers his skin color going so pallid and gray, it looked as though the man was made of marble. Bob Stuckey has this same coloration right this moment in the dim light of the tunnel, as though he's been in agony for quite a long while now. His face so drawn and lifeless, it looks like someone has sucked the air out of it. The fleshy bags under his eyes are so wrinkled they remind Lily of the skin of a balloon that has been deflated. Lily's heart begins to race. She rises to a kneeling position, cradles his head, and says, "Bob, can you hear me? Can you understand?" He manages a nod, and then a sort of crooked grin. Very softly, very breathlessly, he says, "Don't have to yell. I'm old, but I ain't deaf." Lily recognizes in his halting, wheezing words the sound of an oxygen-starved, late-stage heart attack. A tremendous stab of emotion slices through her, as she realizes he probably crawled all this way from the Elkins Creek Junction in unimaginable pain. She takes him by the shoulders, gently lifting him so they are eye to eye. "Bob, is it a heart attack, you think?" He manages a nod. "Can you breathe?" With great effort. "Not great. No." What do I do? Tell me what to do. You're the fucking medic. He swallows with difficulty and looks like he's about to fall asleep. He manages a shake of his head, probably indicating that there isn't shit she can do. His eyelids flutter for a moment. Stay with me! She shakes him. Breathe! She straddles him. I'm going to try CPR. She barely remembers it from her lifeguard days, but what the hell else is she going to do? Here we go. She crosses her hands on his upper sternum and gives him 3 sharp nudges. She has no idea what she's doing. Breathe, bub! Breathe! She bends down and pinches his nose and breathes into his mouth. 3 sharp breaths. Breathe! 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 Bob's eyes have rolled back in his head and his body has gone limp. No, God damn it, no fucking way! She clenches her fists and pounds his chest as hard as she can. You fucking asshole! You don't do this to me now! She hunches down and blows into his mouth as though trying to inflate the balloon back to where it was. Bob, stay with me, please. Bob, please! Behind her, the swarm reacts to the commotion, the chain link rattling as they press inward, harder and harder, the watery growls rising into a hellish, dissonant commentary. Lily looks over her shoulder at them. Shut the fuck up! She feels something tugging at her sweatshirt and looks down and sees Bob's huge, coarse hand clutching the fabric of her shirt tail as though holding on for dear life. He looks as though he's trying to say something. His liver-colored lips tremble, his mouth working desperately to get words out. Lily climbs off of him, kneels next to him, leans down and tries to hear. Bob's voice is drowned out by the clamor of the swarm, the husky baritone growls bouncing off the walls and the inside of Lily's skull. She turns and shrieks at the biters at the top of her lungs. You fucking sacks of shit! Shut your fucking rotten mouths! Bob tries desperately to speak. He clutches her shirt with the last soupçon of energy left in him. She kneels down and pushes her ear to his lips. She concentrates on the breathy whisper coming out of him. The word love and the word you are the only things she can make out at first. Then she hears the words, Lily girl, very clearly, and she registers the complete sentence. Love you, Lily girl. Bob? His grip on her shirt is loosened. His hand falls to the tunnel floor. His body relaxes and goes still. She shakes him gently. Bob! His face has changed. The furrows of wrinkles corrugating his brow have smoothed out, and so have the crow's feet around his hound dog eyes. The pain has left his face. An expression that Lily can only think of as tranquil has passed over his features. Oh, Jesus! She embraces the lifeless shell in her arms. She hugs him tighter than she has ever hugged another human being, and she keeps hugging him for a long time in that gloomy tunnel with the atonal chorus of snarls echoing off the walls, reverberating down the arteries of the labyrinth. Lily tenderly lays the body back down on the tunnel floor, and she closes its eyes. She leans down and plants a soft kiss on the forehead. Her tears fall onto the chest, soaking into the tattered denim shirt. She wipes her eyes. She feels something cutting into her leg, something sharp, and looks down. Bob's left hand, frozen in death, clutches a bundle of dynamite. Lily stares at the 10-inch paper sticks wound with duct tape. She stares at them for a long time, thinking, listening to the horrible grinding noise of the dead. Chapter 20. The preacher rides on the RV's sideboard the whole way around the north outskirts of the village. The morning is turned raw and overcast, a thin layer of haze filtering the pale sun, and Reese Lee Hawthorne drives the camper with caution, the other vehicles chugging along single file behind him, a flash of fully automatic gunfire from an AR-15 or a machine pistol sparking out the windows now and again when the edge of the horde gets too close, or one of the stray drones happens to shuffle out into their path. The town is ringed in hundreds and hundreds of walking dead, all of them showing the patina of 2+ years outdoors on the endless treadmill of super hunger. With skin like old wax paper that's been wadded and smoothed back out, eyes buried in sacks of pus, articles of clothing so sodden with bile that they have the consistency of grease paint. These pathetic creatures have turned the atmosphere hanging over town into a rancid cesspool of decay. The 1,000 or so walkers swarming Woodbury have stalled for some reason, stuck in a loop of lumbering circles around the derelict parks and boarded storefronts, the slow dance of a phonograph needle skipping over and over again on the same groove. Reverend Jeremiah Garlett squints into the ashy, diffused sky as the light glints off a sign on the empty, bullet-riddled water tower east of town. Woodbury, a peach of a place. And he smiles, his bald dome crawling with goose flesh, his eyes stinging from the acrid tang of death on the wind. He wishes his father could see him now. The preacher's become the spiritual guide of the unwashed masses, the ruler of the end days. He will take this town back from the dead in the names of Master Sergeant Daniel Herbert Garlitz and all that the old man stood for: discipline, rigor, purity, faith, and a bone-deep fear of God, the foundation of a new society.
Okay, let's get to work.
The preacher gazes over his shoulder at the other vehicles coming up on each flank, and he gives a signal. A circular motion with one index finger, and the 4 pickups, 2 flatbed trucks, and 1 tow truck rasp to a stop one at a time on the bare ground of a vacant lot about 50 yards east of the main gate. The incriminating tracks go unnoticed by the preacher and his men. The markings already faded to ghostly traces among the myriad furrows and ruts crisscrossing the sandy earth of the lot. Over the last couple of years, countless footprints and tire marks have left their imprints on the square acre of weeds and bare ground, only to blow asunder in a matter of days. The most recent set of tracks, a series of mysterious, inexplicable parallel grooves spanning a width of almost 40 feet, are nearly gone. This is the nature of Woodbury's topography. When the town was originally established in the 19th century, it bore the name Sandtown, for the proliferation of white sand that covers the ground here. And even today, the powdery stuff gets into everything, from gas tanks to laundry hanging on clotheslines. Some claim to feel the grit in their teeth whenever they eat. Tire tracks, even those of a huge, unidentified conveyance the size of a battleship, don't last long here. Now, all around the lot, vehicle doors creak open. Men climb out of cabs. Guns sit on hips and rest on shoulders and remain in holsters. Not a single man bothers to take cover. Careful reconnaissance has convinced everyone that the town is currently populated only by the dead. No reason to hurry. A spirit of inevitability pervades. Manifest destiny. They will make this their home, their base of operations, their seat of power amidst the ruins of the plague, just as Brother Jeremiah has promised them. The preacher hops off the running board, his 9mm Glock in his right hand, the safety off, cocked and ready.
On my signal, he calls to his men. And make every bullet count, boys.
He pauses and stands calmly before the swarm, as if impervious to the dangers coalescing near the hole in the barricade less than 100 feet away. Several of the biters have reacted to the noise of the convoy and the sound of the preacher's rich baritone voice calling out over the wind. The monsters turn, one by one, and lock their shark-like gazes on the man in black and his associates fanning out on either side of the lot. Jeremiah calmly surveys the southeast corner of Woodbury and the throngs gathered inside the gap in the wall, and he's about to give the order to fire when he frowns. He clearly remembers 2 massive semi-trucks parked grill to grill across the huge gaping opening in the barricade, the makeshift castle gate. Where the hell are they? And something else is bothering him. The configuration of the wall seems to have changed. More of the walkers have started to shamble toward him, sniffing him and his men, locking onto them like ravenous dogs on the hunt, drooling and snarling wetly, closing the distance to 50 feet or so. Jeremiah stares at the street corner just inside the break in the barricade, and he notices that somebody has moved the wall, perhaps recently and most definitely hurriedly. He can see the marks on the pavement, and the new boards shored up against the weathered planks of the original wall. It doesn't occur to him that there could be a safe area behind this hastily repositioned section of barricade spanning a square block between Dogwood Lane and Jones Mill Road. It doesn't register immediately because he smells the encroaching wave of dead and sees the walkers coming toward him, now only 30 feet away. He decides it's time to clear this town for good. Clear it in the name of the Lord. Crouching down in the rancid darkness of the tributary, the air buzzing with the moaning of the dead, Lily Call feels her soul sinking into the primordial sediments beneath her, draining out of her as she holds the limp form to her chest, stroking the dead man's hair, cradling the back of his skull as though he were a sick child. She can still detect the faintest whiff of juicy fruit gum radiating off the body, that sickeningly sweet, powdery candy smell just beneath the pervasive stench of mortified flesh. And this breaks Lily's heart. It's as though Bob Stuckey's life force stubbornly refuses to relinquish this realm. In the form of a stale piece of Wrigley's chewing gum still lodged somewhere in the man's mouth, Bob's essence holds on long past his death. Lily's tears trace the edges of her cheeks. As hot and bitter as scalding vinegar, they soak the edges of Bob's filthy chambray shirt. Lily's right hand slowly moves down to her right thigh. I'm so sorry, Bob. We could have made this town work. She feels the tiny, nubby beaver-tail grip of her Bowie knife. She closes her eyes and wills her hand to wrap around the knife's hilt. The webbing between her thumb and forefinger presses against the handle as she slowly, reluctantly draws it out of its sheath. Her other hand remains on the back of Bob's head, gently cradling his skull. She discreetly lifts the blade. I love you, old hoss, she whispers into his ear, tenderly kissing a hairy earlobe. Her voice is drowned out by the churning, rasping chorus of growls rising up behind the barrier of chain link 20 feet away. With one hard, sharp thrust, she drives the tip of the blade into the back of the man's skull between the cords of his neck, never once breaking her embrace, never once pulling away from his ear. The blade sinks at least 6 inches into his brain. Jeremiah gazes up at the darkening sky, takes a deep, girding breath, turns, and starts to give the order to clear the walkers when he hears a strange sound. A voice coming from behind him, emanating from the heart of the swarm, belonging to a living person, piercing the din. Now! Fire! Jeremiah whirls around just in time to see the 4 walkers leading the pack suddenly throw off their tattered overcoats and bile-spattered rags. The preacher stares, paralyzed with shock, his gun still gripped at his side as he utters under his breath, "What is Satan wrought?" The 4 lead walkers reveal themselves to be living humans, camouflaged in the garb of the dead, covered with gruesome muck, their scents drowned by layers of death stench harvested from a corpse. Each of them is holding an assault-style rifle. Jeremiah manages to raise his Glock and get off a single shot before diving for cover under the RV. The preacher's round goes high and to the left, pinging off a high-tension wire. Then things begin to transpire very quickly, over the course of a single minute and a half, all of it practically happening at once, beginning with Harold Staubach's answering the blast, with a quick controlled burst from his Bushmaster, lighting up the air between him and the other men, strafing the side of the RV with a necklace of sparks as the preacher rolls under the camper's massive chassis. Some of the other caravan members immediately lunge behind open truck doors and fenders, instinctively taking cover, while others try to get off shots before leaping behind vehicles. Within seconds, the 4 faux monsters unleash hellfire. David Stern empties a Tech-9 machine pistol on full auto directly at Chester Gleason. The grizzled laborer tries to return fire with his HK-416, but the weapon jams, and the volley of armor-piercing rounds perforates his chest and his left shoulder and his neck, sending him staggering backward in an envelope of blood mist. He's dead before he hits the ground. At the same time, Norma Sutter stands on David's right flank, firing her AR-15 wildly, not really presenting much of a threat, but howling a spontaneous war cry supercharged by her skills as a gospel choir director. 50 yards away, Stephen Pembry leaps out of his tow truck with an old M16 and tries to fire. But before he can squeeze off a single shot, one of Norma's stray rounds strikes him full-on between the eyes, the definition of a lucky shot, and sends him staggering backward, his skull snapping back in a fog of pink spray, the impact knocking him to the ground, where he will lie and expire over the remaining seconds of the skirmish. Miles Littleton fares a little better in the aiming department, as he brooms the area with a fusillade of .308 caliber bullets from his AK-47, some of the rounds finding the two gunmen crouched behind pickups 30 yards due west. The armor-piercing bullets penetrate the flimsy layers of Detroit steel, fiberglass, and upholstery, hitting each gunman dead center, perforating lungs and carotid arteries and sending the men flinging backward, arms pinwheeling into the oblivion of weeds and organ failure. By this point, the preacher has attempted to return fire from under the enormous Winnebago, but his 9mm pistol is woefully outmatched, its fire rate far too low to make a dent in the attack. The three Avengers are now simply spraying the general vicinity with uncontrolled volleys, spitting centipedes of dust and debris off the ground, strafing the sides of vehicles, leaving chains of divots and tufts in the metal, pinging and ringing off grillwork and fenders, bursting door glass, vaporizing windshields into sheets of sparkling particles that implode across dashes and seats. 3 more acolytes go down. Earl Jericho, a pear-shaped man in denim and a Braves cap, gets it in the neck and shoulder, spinning in a bloody pirouette before slamming into the side of his pickup and sliding to the ground. A skinny, tattooed former biker for Jesus named Thurston Breen manages to dodge the spray of high-caliber slugs as he races for cover, but absorbs a series of gut shots while trying to crawl under the chassis of his flatbed stake truck. He rolls out from under the vehicle and curls into a fetal ball and dies more slowly than the rest. Many of the stray ricochets and errant blasts go into the oncoming surge of walkers, but it doesn't take long for the mass of reanimated corpses to overrun the vacant lot, despite the crossfire turning the air into a cloud bank of blue smoke, most of the dead flowing in from the adjacent streets and meadows. The 4 disguised guardians of Woodbury now slam new magazines into their weapons and begin to back away slowly, according to plan, as the oncoming horde engulfs the lot. Chester Gleason's body attracts a large number of the early arrivals, at least a dozen or more of the creatures descending upon his remains, their hunched forms rooting down into him for the truffles of his still-warm organs. The feeding frenzy intensifies as more of the things flood the battleground and find the other victims of the gunfight, the wounded, the fallen. David Stern orders his fellow counter-assailants back into the safe zone behind the wall at Dogwood Street, his voice hollering above the din. "Hurry! Hurry! Hurry!" They all turn and trot after him. Harold Staubach doesn't see the glint of gunmetal 50 yards behind him, sticking out from under the Winnebago, as Jeremiah takes aim. Nobody sees the preacher fire off a single shot until it's too late. Harold is approaching the safe zone when the solitary round rips through his shoulder, throwing him off his feet and sprawling him across the asphalt road. Almost instantly, without a word, 2 things happen in response. Miles Littleton opens up on the camper, firing 3 controlled bursts from his AK, driving the preacher back under the RV, and David and Norma simultaneously grab hold of Harold by the shoulders and start to drag him toward the fence at Dogwood Street. But they're too late. The street before them crawls with walkers, drawn to the commotion of the firefight. So many that David freezes practically in mid-stride, surveying the ragged mob of the dead weaving toward him, drunk with hunger and kill-lust, arms reaching, and yells at the top of his lungs, "Plan B! Plan B!" For a long while, in the noisy darkness of the tributary, Lily remains in a desperate embrace with Bob's remains, the knife still buried to the hilt in his skull. Her eyes have welled up again as the warmth of his cerebrospinal fluids continue to gush around the knife's hilt and run down her arm and under her sleeve. She's soaked with it. She hears a slight release of something that sounds like a faint puff of air, but Lily can't tell if it's coming from the wound or from Bob's lungs. His body remains limp and lifeless in her arms. The noise of the dead rumbles and chugs nearby, drowning out the faint and distant crackle of gunfire. It feels to Lily as though a storm is gathering inside her, as she gently lays the body back down on the tunnel floor. She positions the head so it's facing straight up. The puddle of blood beneath it is spread like black motor oil across the cracked hard-packed floor. She carefully rests Bob's hands on his midsection. Ancient Egyptians buried their dead with family pets, tools, scrolls, food, even coins for the afterlife, as though the deceased were simply embarking on a trip. Lily digs in her pocket. She puts her lucky coin, an old buffalo nickel that her father Everett had given her, on Bob's eyelid. She leans down and softly kisses the bridge of his nose. She touches his cheek one last time, feeling the storm front moving in from deep within her core. Black clouds of rage start to migrate up through her, pulling a dark shade down across her field of vision. Rising to her feet, she gazes back down the tributary and sees the swarm, now at least 100 or more squeezed into the main conduit, pressing against the waffle of metal links. Their wormy gray faces puckering with hunger, their milky eyes wide with bloodlust. They drool and sputter and moan and try to squeeze their blackened fingers through the 2-inch square triangles. The cyclone fencing barely holds, creaking with the pressure of their collective weight. It looks as though the barrier is about to snap. Lily reaches down to Bob's holster and pulls his .357. She snaps open the center and sees only 2 rounds remaining in the cylinder. She feels alongside the underside of his belt and finds the tiny leather pouch with the speed loader. She pulls it free and sticks it in her pocket. She digs some more and finds his lighter and a roll of safety fuse. She removes his watch and pockets it. The anger fuels her now, courses through her veins, galvanizes her, gets her up and moving. She rises to her feet and walks across the tunnel to the chain-link barrier, and she stands there for a moment. Her close proximity stirs the creatures into frenzies. The growls rise into gravelly ululations, like the howls of hyenas, the cold eyes widening, teeth gnashing frantically to get a piece of her. Some of them push harder, warping the chain-link fencing inward to its absolute limit. The odor is incredibly horrible. Lily stares impassively at them. She comes to within inches of their moldering mouths. She stares into their empty eyes. The rage storm inside Lily has begun to unleash torrents of adrenaline, lightning and thunder rumbling, squalls of emotion erupting in her veins. The bundle of dynamite sits on the floor near the chain-link barrier. Lily pulls the detonator cord and the roll of safety fuse from her pocket, never once taking her eyes off the creatures trying to squeeze through the screen of fencing and get to her tender flesh. She goes over to the explosives, picks them up, and pushes the det cord into the spongy end cap, her gaze still riveted on the walkers. She sits the bundle of dynamite on the floor in front of them, as though setting down a food dish for a family pet. "There you go," she murmurs, her voice sounding foreign to her ears. It sounds thick and coarse with fury, the voice of a gladiator about to enter the ring. "Chew on that for a while." She turns and starts on her way eastward, carefully unfurling the 50 feet or so of safety fuse as she goes along, hastening toward the sewer manhole under Riggins Ferry Road. Soaked in sweat, heart racing, Jeremiah breathes in and out through his mouth, the stench so thick it threatens to strangle him. He lies prone on the cold ground beneath the greasy chassis of the RV, still holding his 9mm pistol. Chaos surrounds the vehicle. All his followers are gone. Bodies are strewn across the lot like driftwood. But the good Lord is still with Jeremiah. Fate always wins out, and it will prevail today if the preacher can just manage to get out of this mess. He looks to his immediate left and sees through the reeds of wild grass and stiff-legged walkers brushing against the camper, a small swarm still hovering over Chester Gleason's body, sucking the marrow from what's left of him. Jeremiah lets out a pained sigh, his breath blowing dust off the ground next to his lips. He looks to his right and sees countless ragged legs, some of them sticking out of dresses, looking spindly and cadaverous as they trundle aimlessly back and forth. Intermittently, the preacher catches glimpses of his other disciples, half of Riesly Hawthorne over there, his remains spilling its purple glistening delicacies for the swarm. Stephen Pembry over there, reduced to a pile of partially clothed guts. And the sight of such carnage makes Jeremiah twitch with cognitive dissonance. Is this what God wants? Is this what awaits Jeremiah himself in this everlasting darkness of the rapture? He manages to twist around and gaze down the length of the Winnebago's undercarriage toward its tail end. He blinks. Is he hallucinating? He starts crawling toward the daylight at the rear of the RV, his gaze locked on a gap in the throng. He reaches the rear phalanx of exhaust pipes and trailer hitch and looks out beyond the adjacent switchyard of petrified train tracks and ancient directional signage. He sees a clear opening, an empty corridor of space between two halves of the multitude where the mob of walkers has randomly separated. On the far side of this opening sits a small building that looks relatively secure, its windows boarded or barred. If Jeremiah can slip unnoticed through the momentary break in the herd, he might be able to get to that building and gain entrance before he too is reduced to bloody fodder. His heart speeds up. He sucks in a searing hot breath. Then he crawls out from under the RV, springs to his feet, and charges as fast as he can toward the station house, where the children secretly huddle in the shadows, trying so desperately to be quiet. Chapter 21. Barbara Stern sits on the floor behind the dusty shelving units at the northeast corner of the litter-strewn station house, bracing herself on the shelf legs as though waiting out a tornado. The kids sit on each of her flanks, trying to concentrate on their coloring books and sketch pads and little golden books like The Poky Little Puppy and The Little Red Hen, while the world is turned upside down outside their boarded windows. Every time a burst of gunfire crackles in the distance, or a sonic boom from a shotgun lights up the sky, or a cluster of walkers brushes up against the wood frame outer walls, the older kids twitch and flinch, while the younger ones whimper under their breaths as though they've been kicked in the gut. Barbara keeps whispering for them to relax. It's going to be okay. They have a good plan, and Lily and Bob know what they're doing. But her nerves are as raw and exposed as those of the children. She grips those shelf legs with white-knuckle pressure at the boom of each salvo, holding on so tightly that the molded steel has begun to make bloody indentations on her palms. She keeps thinking she can identify the make and model of each gun as she hears its blast, and that she doesn't hear the blat of David's Tech-9, and this is driving her crazy. The machine pistol that they found a few weeks ago in the storage rooms of the Meriwether County National Guard Depot has a distinctive sound, a sort of shrill metallic rattle, like a baby howitzer. She hasn't heard that noise for many minutes, and her brain keeps going to the worst-case scenario, flashing on images of David lying bullet-riddled and torn apart by walkers, and this makes her grip the shelf legs even tighter. In fact, she's trying to drive these very images from her brain when she hears a noise coming from across the room that sets her teeth on edge and makes her flesh rash with goosebumps. "Don't move," she hisses at the children, pulling herself up and switching off the safety on her .44 Bulldog. The gun is extremely heavy for a snub-nosed revolver, and it seems to have gotten heavier over the last few hours. In addition, the trigger action is stiff, hard to pull. But at the moment, Barbara feels as though she could crack the grip in half with her bare hand. The noise of someone trying to force the knob on the side door rattles again across the room, and Barbara assumes the shooting position as she approaches, gun in both hands, finger on the trigger pad, shoulders squared while she blows a long tendril of gray hair from her face. She makes sure to hold her Zuftig body at an angle to the door, so her right shoulder will absorb much of the recoil from the massive handgun. She reaches the door and puts her ear against the wooden frame, holding the Bulldog's muzzle up at the ceiling. She hears a frantic shuffling, someone huffing and puffing. She's about to call out when the door suddenly explodes inward, bursting open with the force of a battering ram. The jam smacks Barbara straight on, knocking her senseless, driving her backward and sending her to the floor. She lands on her ass, the Bulldog spinning off across the parquet tile. Her vision wavers, her ears ringing, as she tries to crawl toward the gun. At the corner of Dogwood and Jones Mill, in a curtain of cordite, smoke, dust, and death stench as thick as gauze, Miles Littleton goes through an entire 10-round magazine, momentarily keeping the leading edge of the Walker horde at bay, while David and Norma attempt to drag Harold Staubach out of harm's way. Harold is having none of it. "Forget it!" Lying on his side, sucking in raspy breaths, he pushes them away, kicking feebly, his shoulder in shreds, the front of his tunic a deep crimson red, drenched in arterial blood which soaks the pavement.
Just go! Go!
He flinches as another walker drops to the cobblestones mere inches away from his right foot, half its head blown asunder by the dum-dums from David's Glock.
Shut up! Shut the fuck up! We're not leaving you, and that's all there is to it!
David barks his words at him, refusing to let go, dragging the older man another 10 feet or so toward the barricade. Norma tries to take Harold's feet and lifts him up, but Harold kicks her off with his last drops of energy.
Y'all are gonna get yourselves killed!
Harold screams at them, his voice breaking, his strength draining away. He tries to push David Stern off of him. David's hands are slimy with blood, and Harold slips from his grasp. Collapsing back to the pavement, Harold lets out a gasp, his beautiful singing voice finally starting to crumble.
I'm done for. I'm gone. You've got to get yourself inside.
Miles fires another burst into the column of biters pressing toward them. More and more of the creatures, drawn to the noise and commotion, surround them, closing in like a fist. In a few seconds it will be too late. Their ammunition is dwindling to nothing. A few more bursts from the AK and that will be it. The young car thief fires a short salvo, hitting the 3 closest walkers. One of the putrid heads explodes in a cloud of black fluids, and another snaps back so far it almost rips free. The owner of the 3rd head keeps coming, the blast only grazing its temple.
Too many of them!
Miles screams. He is trying to fire another controlled burst, but now the gun only clicks impotently.
Fuck! Shit! Shit!
The walkers engulf them. Miles pulls a machete from a sheath on his leg. Norma grabs a garden spade strapped to her pack, and David is grunting and huffing as he drags Harold farther and farther away from the throngs. Harold wavers in and out of consciousness as more of the creatures press in from the west, cutting off their escape route. The persistent din of guttural growling rises up all around them now, as loud as a jet engine, the stench unbearable, the hooked fingers of outstretched arms clawing at the air. Harold finally passes out, and David shakes him, feeling for a pulse. Miles and Norma put up a valiant last-ditch effort to fight the creatures off, flailing madly at them, lashing out at one dead pasty face after another, striking some in the eye socket, others in the forehead, still others up through the mandible. But it's futile. There are far too many of them now. So many that David's view of the barricade is cut off, blocked by the mob. He lets out a howl of rage. Harold is dead weight now. David collapses next to the older man, heaving pained breaths. Norma trips over them and falls to the paving stones. Miles flails and flails until he stumbles over his own feet and sprawls to the pavers next to the others. And in that horrible moment of anguish, that single frozen instant before they are engulfed and devoured, David shares a feverish glance with the others. It's as though they all realize the same thing at precisely the same moment. They are all going to die. And worse than that, they are going to die at the ravenous hands of the dead, torn apart, eviscerated, though they're a stone's throw of safety. Only so much can be communicated in a single look, especially in a moment of suspended time such as this. But somehow, David Stern manages to gaze so deeply into Norma Sutter's sweaty, maternal, old-soul face right at that moment that he sees his last fleeting thought return from her in a wordless response. At least we'll go down together as one. Here in this desolate situation, we'll perish in each other's arms. Norma nods at David, and then puts her plump arms around him. David looks away from the fish-belly faces and shoe-button eyes as the creatures descend en masse upon them, and he has just closed his eyes and clasped on to the matronly Norma Sutter's, when he suddenly hears a noise that rises above the jet engine rasp of the dead. And the noise is such a welcome surprise, David Stern silently begins to cry. At first it sounds like a tea kettle on the boil, a thin, shrill whistle. But then it swells into a shriek. David realizes the whistle is the sound of a young boy screaming. This is followed by the roar of a diesel engine, which farts a plume of black, acrid smoke into the air behind the adjacent barricade. David's heart leaps, his breath seizing up in the back of his throat. A thunderous explosion shatters the morning air, piercing the droning chorus of growls, and David Stern recoils with a start as the makeshift barrier of wooden siding and drywall 50 feet away suddenly collapses, the board slamming down to the ground with a resounding series of thuds, and in a storm cloud of dust, a gargantuan contraption emerges from behind the fallen barricade. David recognizes the massive front blades of the International Harvester Combine. The kid is early. God bless his little snot-nosed soul. The kid never could keep track of time. That beautiful, perfect little man. Like a tidal wave of gleaming metal, the 30-foot wide mouth, filled with rows of razor-sharp blades, churns toward the swarm, kicking up waves of debris and particles of prairie grass. A stream of detritus pours out the top of the vent stack as the enormous machine chugs and whirs toward the closest moving corpses. Up in the high cab, encased in glass like a tiny emperor, Tommy Dupree sits at the controls. The kid learned to operate the showroom new Harvester by reading the owner's manual, and the jerky way he's steering the thing reveals how green his skills are. But the livid, furrowed face behind the tinted glass of the pilot cubicle also shows his determination, which triggers another thought in the back of David Stern's traumatized mind. Thank God for Plan B. On the floor, dazed and breathless from the pain shooting down her spine, Barbara Stern can see only blurry impressions of the huge man who has lunged into the station house after kicking the door open. Tall, middle-aged, dressed in an ashy black funereal suitcoat, bald as a billiard ball, face all broken out, blotchy and livid, eyes crazy, he slams the door shut, then registers the fact that his entrance has knocked a 60-something woman dressed in a floral print muumuu over onto her fulsome ass. He's still hyperventilating from the terror and fatigue of sprinting across 150 yards of walker-infested real estate as he scans the dusty, cluttered station house. The thud of a dozen biters hitting the door outside vibrates the air. "Whoa, Nellie!" He lets out a deep, husky exclamation when he sees Barbara crawling toward her gun. He leaps across the room and reaches her at the precise moment she gets her hand around the bulldog. "Hold on there, sis." He kicks the gun out of her sweaty grasp, the bulldog spinning in the other direction. Barbara Stern tries to roll away. The Slocum twins squeal in horrified unison as the preacher kicks the woman hard in the kidney with his big Wellington. Barbara gasps and rolls across the floor and tries to see where her gun went. Her vision blurs. Her nose gushes from the impact of the door, and she may or may not have bit her tongue, her mouth filling with the coppery warmth of blood as she tries to crawl toward the bulldog. She senses the huge presence of the intruder looming over her. "Calm down!" his voice booms. A deep, smoky, stentorian instrument trained in the sacristies and revival tents of charismatic religions. His face shines with exertion. He slams a boot down in Barbara Stern's dress. "It ain't like I'm gonna eat you." "Okay." Barbara breathlessly surrenders, flopping onto her side, bleeding profusely down the front of her muumuu. Her chin drips, the bridge of her nose throbbing, an occasional sharp stab behind her eyes. She blinks and holds up her trembling hands. "Okay." "Here." He digs in his breast pocket and pulls out a handkerchief. In the momentary lull, Barbara can hear the sound of the herd outside, an enormous, rusty, spinning turbine surrounding the station house. And she can hear something else, something in the distance mingling with the din, vibrating the air, a low grinding noise that's as deep and raspy as the largest pipe on a church organ. Jeremiah throws the hanky and it lands on Barbara's legs. Then he goes over to the bulldog, picks it up, checks the cylinder, and thrusts it down the back of his belt. "Do whatever you need to do to me," Barbara murmurs, picking up the cloth and pressing it down on her nose. Her voice muted now by the fabric of the cloth and her congested airways, she says thickly, "But I'm asking you. Please. I'm begging you as a man of God, as a Christian. Don't mess with these children. Don't hurt them. They have nothing to do with this." He shoots a glance over at the cluster of kids hunkered and cowering behind the shelves. They look like scared animals in a cage. A soft, continuous whimpering comes from the younger ones. The preacher smiles. He speaks without taking his eyes off the little ones. "It's hard to disagree with you, sis. But they got everything to do with this." He ambles over to the shelving unit, shoves it aside as though it were made of balsa wood, and gives the kids the once-over with the gleaming eyes. The whimpering intensifies. The preacher's simian gaze settles on Bethany Dupree. She appears to be the only child who isn't either hiding behind a sibling, crying, or gazing meekly down at the floor. She stands her ground, her hands on her hips as though she disapproves of the whole concept of this man. She meets his gaze with a withering sort of contempt. The preacher grins. His face twitches.
"You're a pistol, ain't you?"
"Leave us alone," she says.
"You'll do nicely."
He grabs her by the arm and pulls her out of hiding. By this point, Barbara has managed to crawl across the floor, and now she struggles to her feet. The dizziness makes her head spin. She still can't see very well. She wavers slightly as she stands there holding the blood-soaked hanky to her nose, watching the preacher pull the little girl across the room toward the boarded window. "Don't do this, Jeremiah," Barbara says. The preacher turns and faces the older woman in the blood-spattered muumuu. He draws his Glock and casually presses the barrel against the side of Bethany Dupree's head. All the fight goes out of the little girl's face. Her eyes moisten, and she swallows a big gulp of air, and her lips curl downward as she tries her hardest not to cry. The preacher's voice is flat and cold.
"The wheel's already in motion, sis. There's nothing any of us can do. This here's the rapture. We all been left behind, and now we're all just playing what you might call a big old board game." The girl wriggles in his grasp, and Jeremiah tightens his grip on her collar, pressing the muzzle harder against her little pigtail. "The rivers are running red, sis." Jeremiah burns his gaze into Barbara. "Birds falling out of the sky, and the living wants me dead. This here tot, she's my little insurance policy." Without any warning, a small child darts out from behind the shelf. Barbara whirls to see Lucas Dupree, his little 5-year-old face furrowed with rage, his tiny fists clenched white-knuckle tight, racing toward the preacher, screaming, "Let her be!" Barbara drops the bloody cloth and deftly lunges toward the boy, snatching him up before he can cross the room, lifting him off his feet. The boy's feet continue to run in place in the air, in a cartoonish pantomime. He's already beginning to sob as Barbara hugs him to her bosom and strokes the back of his hair. "Okay, Bruiser, that's far enough. She's gonna be fine. It's okay. Easy now." Barbara caresses the boy's head and speaks softly, but never takes her eyes off of the preacher. "This man is not gonna hurt your sister. He's just gonna borrow her for a second." Barbara's eyes narrow almost to slits, fixing themselves on the preacher. "And if anything happens to her, even if a single hair on her head is mussed, the people who survive here today, whoever they may be, they're going to dedicate the remainder of their lives, however long that might be, to finding this man, this minister, this man of God, and making him sorry that he was ever born. Do you understand?" Two individuals have listened closely to this soliloquy. The boy with his head buried in Barbara's chest, nodding slightly, and the preacher, who has gone very still through all this, regarding the woman with a strange mixture of malice and admiration. At last, with the gun still pressed to the little girl's head, he gives the woman a respectful nod. "Message received, sis. I think we could have very well done business together in another life." He drags the little girl to the door. She keeps her tears tamped down. The preacher gives Barbara one last glimpse over his shoulder. "Keep your powder dry, sis." Then he turns, grasps the doorknob, and opens the door a few centimeters. He peers out and sees an opening. The biters have drifted away from the door. He pulls Bethany out into the pale light of day and makes an awkward run for it. Chapter 22. Jeremiah doesn't get more than 20 paces from the doorway of the derelict station house when he staggers to an abrupt halt. The girl nearly falls over, the stop is so sudden, and for a moment, in that hideous ashen sunlight washing the switchyard, Jeremiah thinks he's seeing a ghost. He stands there, still clutching the little girl's collar, thunderstruck by what stands before him. The deep, sepulchral rumble of a giant combine, incongruously harvesting some unidentified crop where there are no crops, echoes from the northwest corner of town,
accompanying Jeremiah's confusion with a contramelody of gnawing, grating, shredding noises. But the preacher barely notices the surreal, nonsensical sounds, nor does he register the unrelenting drone of the swarm, close enough to see through the neighboring trees and the wreckage-strewn gaps between buildings. The figure that stands directly in front of Jeremiah doesn't move, and doesn't say anything at first. Just stands there with her shoulders squared off, and her gaze fixed on the preacher and the little girl. The breeze tosses the woman's dishwater auburn hair, which is pulled back in a tight French braid, though many tendrils had come loose over the past few hours of exertion, struggle, and trauma underground. Her fashionably ripped jeans and camo jacket are now in shreds, her face and arms scourged with grit, cuts, and bruises. The look in her eyes penetrates Jeremiah's soul, reaching down into a dark place inside him and strumming some dissonant, unexpected chord of fear. Then, Jeremiah notices the enormous revolver with the 4-inch barrel gripped in her right hand, which at the moment hangs at rest at her side, the muzzle pointed down at the ground.
"Look at you,"
the preacher finally says to her.
"All pleased with yourself."
"Let her go." Lily Call's voice is so brittle with rage, so cold. It sounds almost like a recording of a voice played a scintilla too slow. Jeremiah presses the barrel harder against Bethany Dupree's head.
"I don't know how you did it, but it don't matter one whit no more. Nothing does."
"I don't think you heard me." Jeremiah lets out a dry chuckle.
"Acts of heroism, sacrifice, things done for the better good. None of it means high holy hell anymore."
"Excuse me. You're gonna die today." Lily augurs her gaze into his. "You might as well do something good beforehand to shore things up a little." Jeremiah feels the hate rise up his gorge and fill his mouth with the bitter taste of odium.
"Get out of my way, missy."
Lily calmly raises the gun, aims it at him, and holds up a watch in her free hand. It looks cheap, shop-worn, like an old Timex on a faded leather strap. "You know what this is?"
"No more games!"
Jeremiah presses the barrel so hard against the head of the little girl, her whimpers intensify to outright sobbing, her head bending over with the pressure of the muzzle. Jeremiah practically growls the words.
"The death of this precious little girl will be on your eternal soul."
"It's a watch," Lily casually informs him, ignoring his threats, indicating with a nod the importance of the used timepiece. "Belonged to Bob Stuckey, a man whose death is on your worthless fucking soul." She glances at the second hand. "And if my calculations are correct, we should have about 10 sec—" The muffled explosion from below cuts off her words with the abruptness of a jump cut in a film. Lily's estimate was 10 seconds off. The ground seems to shudder slightly as the heat wave rams into the back of Lily's neck. The noise is enormous and ear-shattering, cracking open the humid air and breaking windows as far as Canyon Road. Deafened by the boom, Lily staggers forward and then sprawls to the ground in the aftershock. The sky behind her cleaves apart in a fountain of dirt, the particles of orange Georgia clay spewing upward in a vast smoke cloud that scrapes the clouds before dissipating. The preacher stumbles backward, trips over his feet, and falls on his ass. The little girl staggers and goes down as well. Granules of dirt, litter, and unidentified shards of the underground rain down on them. The aftershocks tremble across the switchyard as the tunnels give way below and bury human and undead alike for eternity. Lily tries to rise to her feet, but can only lift herself up to her hands and knees. Her head spins. She can't hear a thing, and she can barely see. Blinking frantically, she tries to focus on where her gun went. She sees it lying about 5 feet away. She lunges toward it, grabs it, and swings it up as she springs to her feet. She quickly assumes an offensive stance, but everything has gone all hazy and slow in the aftermath of the explosion. Ears ringing, Lily sees the preacher running away, his lanky arms pumping, his tattered waistcoat flapping in the wind as he charges as fast as he can toward the vacant lot to the east. With her gun still gripped in both hands, Lily shuffles toward the girl. Little Bethany slowly rises, holding her ears, looking up at the sky. "You okay, sweetie?" Lily kneels by her, quickly giving her a once-over, looking for wounds. Lily can barely hear, the ringing in her ears like a drill buzzing in her skull. She sees no injuries. "Talk to me!" "I can't hear anything!" The little girl holds her ears, opening her mouth as though trying to make them pop back into service. "It's okay, sweetie. It's temporary. It's the noise of the explosion." "How did you do that?" Lily glances over her shoulder. "We'll talk about it later, honey. Right now, we gotta get you back inside and I gotta get to the safe zone." In that single feverish moment, Lily sees several things that quicken her pulse. About 100 yards away, the preacher is weaving through a cluster of walkers, slashing at them left and right with his buck knife, apparently trying to work his way back to the vacant lot east of the switchyard. The same vacant lot across which all the gunfire had been exchanged. Adrenaline trickles through Lily. She realizes the son of a bitch is heading toward the enormous tow truck rig that sits about 50 yards south of the lot, still idling, sending intermittent puffs of inky black smoke out of its exhaust stack. The second thing that Lily sees triggers an even bigger spurt of panic. 3 sides of the switchyard are now cut off by dense groups of dead shambling this way, drawn to all the tumult and yelling, their arms like divining rods, stiffly reaching, seeking fresh human meat. Lily spins in a 360-degree pivot, searching for a way out, but seeing none. Even the station house building is engulfed with the things now. Countless decomposing faces close in, pressing inward from all directions, face after face after face, each one featuring the same empty frosted glass eyes, the same slimy lips curling away from blackened teeth. The noise and the odor of them rises to unbearable levels, and Lily finds herself going blank again, as though her brain has just crashed. Somehow, right then, in that fog bank of rot and decay, under that unforgiving pale sun, her ears still ringing, her heart palpitating, the flood of walkers engulfing her and the child, Lily Call realizes she has only one viable option. Once again, the simplest solution proving to be the best solution. She sees a grand total of a half-dozen creatures between her and the front door of the station house, which lies about 50 feet away. "Stay right by my side, sweetie," she says to the girl, and then aims her gun at the 2 cadavers blocking their path to the door. The first shot punches a divot in the top of the closest one's skull, the thing folding in a cascade of black fluids and rancid blood. The second shot rips through the center of the other one's face, sending a cloud of dirty gray fluids out the exit wound. Edging her way toward the building, Lily multitasks now, dumping the empty cylinder, tipping the speed loader into the chamber, injecting her last 6 bullets while simultaneously yanking Bethany toward the door. They get within 3 feet of the entrance when a pair of male biters, each one once a teenage farm kid, now clad in tattered, blood-soaked long underwear, lunge single file, one after the other, at the 2 living humans. The little girl squeals an involuntary shriek as Lily instinctively points the gun at the closest assailant. The biter inadvertently gets caught on the barrel as it pounces, its mouth gaping, the muzzle going down its throat like a tracheal intubation. Lily instantly squeezes off 2 shots. The first one blows the back of the thing's skull off, and the second strikes the walker coming up behind it. Both the males collapse in showers of putrid blood. Lily throws the door open and shoves the girl inside the shadows of the station house, then follows her inside, slamming the door behind them. For a moment, Lily bends down and catches her breath as the little girl races over to Barbara Stern. Lily takes in great, heaving breaths, her hands on her knees, the rage crackling behind her eyes, as bracing as smelling salts. The image of the preacher racing off toward that tow truck has burned itself into her mind's eye. The thought of him getting away makes her spine tingle with hate. More than just the desire to wreak vengeance, more than the mere satisfaction of evening a score. She needs to end this man. "You're a sight for sore eyes," a voice says next to her, making her jump. Lily looks up at Barbara Stern, who stands nearby holding Bethany Dupree against her midriff. The girl softly cries into the folds of Barbara's muumuu. The older woman breathes through her mouth, her face severely swollen, both her eyes rimmed in swelling bruises, her nose inflamed to twice its size, blood crusted around her nostrils. Lily stares. "Speaking of sore eyes, what the hell happened to you?" The preacher happened to me. Barbara takes a deep breath. I'll live. Lily looks at her for a long time. Yeah. But I promise you, he won't. What? What are you talking about? You're not going after him. Lily doesn't answer, simply checks her gun, flipping open the cylinder and seeing she has 4 rounds left. The children watch her from behind the shelves. She snaps the cylinder shut and hurries across the room to the back window, Barbara following her. Lily, answer me. You're not thinking of going after him, are you? Lily is too busy to answer, as she peers out a thin slat of daylight along the edge of the boarded window, gazing at the Woodbury town limits in the middle distance. At first, all she can see is the enormous combine mowing through columns of dead along Dogwood Street. A surreal sight, even from this great distance, like some kind of insanely elaborate irrigation system. Dark matter spews out a tall chimney stack, arcing up at least 50 feet in the air, and then diffusing into a rainbow of wet tissue that sleets down and soaks the ground and the sides of buildings over half a block away. Lily gawks. Upon further scrutiny, it has become clear that the tall stack is actually the vertical vent on the huge farm machine that Tommy Dupree discovered only a few days ago in that gleaming showroom a mile south of here. Originally designed for the laborious job of separating grain from chaff across wide expanses of land, it's now being repurposed, just as Lily and Tommy had devised, for the task of mowing down row after row of shambling cadavers. And for a brief moment, seeing that 30-foot-long mouth of rotating teeth gobbling the roiling masses of dead with the furious efficiency of a macabre assembly line, fills Lily with a sense of inevitability, fate, and maybe even a higher purpose. The sight of that putrescent geyser of gore soaring out through the air behind the harvester synchronizes with her rage. She wants to feed the preacher into the great steel oblivion of those circular teeth. The preacher. Lily scans the outer limits of the town, sweeping her gaze across the adjacent switchyard, past the grove of sickly pecan trees, and into the vacant lot, where the grisly remains of the battlefield still lie in mangled, unidentified heaps like forgotten piles of kindling. In the far distance, beyond the dry creek bed, a lanky, tall figure in black hurriedly climbs up into the cab of a huge, heavy-duty tow truck. The back of the truck, including the massive tow crane, still drips with carnage, the top portion of a prisoner still lashed to the gantry, the bottom half of his torso ripped clean off by the horde, leaving entrails to dangle and dry in the sun. Lily jerks away from the window. She turns and looks around the room as though she's lost something. Answer me, Lily. Barbara gazes skeptically at the younger woman. Lily looks up. Where's the walkie-talkie? You had one with you, right? Don't do this, Lily. Where is it? Come on, Barbara. All right. Barbara sighs, gently moves the little girl aside, and quickly pads across the room. It's right here. She digs through her pack, which sits on a peach crate near the shelving units. The children remain huddled in the shadows behind the adjacent shelves, peering through the gaps like stray puppies held captive in a pound, their eyes huge and bright with terror as they look on. Barbara finds the device and brings it to Lily, who has nervously returned to the window to peer back out at the edge of the vacant lot. The tow truck hasn't moved. The preacher still visible inside the cab, hunched over the wheel. It looks as though the thing won't start. Maybe it's out of gas. Here, Barbara hands her the two-way. But please, don't do this. Lily ignores her. She turns the power on and thumbs the send button. This is Lily. Miles, you out there? Can you hear me? Over. Barbara lets out another anguished sigh. The preacher is gone, Lily. You'll never see him again, and good riddance, I say. Lily waves her back. Shh! The walkie crackles, a voice on the other end of the line breaking through the static. Lily? Lily presses the switch. Miles, is that you? Through the speaker. Yes, ma'am. Barbara clutches Lily's arm. Lily, don't go and get yourself killed over this. It's not worth it. Lily yanks her arm away and then barks into the walkie's mic as she stares through the slat of daylight at the far edge of the vacant lot. She can see a black cloud belch out of the tow truck's exhaust pipe as the preacher finally gets the engine started. Miles, where are you? Are you with the others? Through the static. In the safe zone with Norma, David, and Harold, just like we planned. Lily squeezes the button. Miles, can you get to your car? Another splash of static sizzles from the tiny speaker, and then, after a beat, "I guess so, yeah. She's parked out behind the willow," Lily says into the mic. "By the river, you mean? East of the tunnel entrance?" "That's right. How fast can you get there?" "You mean like now?" "Yes, fuck yes, now, Miles. How soon can you meet me there?" Another beat of staticky silence, then the voice of the car thief sounding skeptical. "A lot of walkers between us and the river, Lily. Just do it!" Her voice slices through the interference like a bolt of lightning. "Everything depends on us getting to your car ASAP. You understand? Tell me you understand, Miles." Through the speaker. "I understand." "Good." Lily looks at Barbara, then back out the window at the tow truck pulling away in a cloud of exhaust and dust. "Get moving, Miles, and bring some firepower, whatever's left, and some extra ammo. I'll meet you there in 5 minutes, maybe less if I get lucky. The preacher's got a head start, but those wheels of yours ought to do the trick." A burst of static, and then Miles's voice. "What are we doing, Lily?" Lily licks her lips and looks at Barbara. She squeezes the switch. "Tying up a loose end." Chapter 23. Miraculously, they both make it to the small clearing east of town at approximately the same time. Lily circumnavigating the herd by taking the long way around the switchyard, avoiding the thickest pockets of dead. Miles getting there by exiting the safe zone along Flat Shoals Road and then circling around the northeast corner of town. Once they get there, things start moving very quickly, far too quickly for them to notice any signs of tampering, such as fluid dripping from the convolutions of the Challenger's undercarriage. By the time they reach the car, they are each far too winded and pumped up with adrenaline to see the broken boughs and branches on the west edge of the clearing, or the freshly formed tire tracks angling across the ground. Sheltered by the shaggy boughs of willow trees, surrounded by thickets of ironweed, the area is bordered on one side by the Flint River and barely large enough to accommodate a full-sized sedan. The neon-purple Dodge Challenger sits in the center of the clearing, gleaming in the pale daylight filtering down through the skeletal branches of black oaks. They don't say much to each other at first, communicating mostly through gestures and nods and quick hand signals. They're in a big hurry. Lily figures the preacher has a 10-minute head start. If they're lucky, they can locate him by the wake of dust and exhaust kicked up by the massive tow truck. But luck will also have to play a part. The preacher could easily take an unexpected turn and be off the grid in the blink of an eye. Miles fires up the 390 horses as Lily climbs in through the passenger door. The gargantuan V8 gargles to life, emitting a belch of black exhaust and the roar of a mint-condition Hemi cold block with 0 catalytic converters to slow things down. Neither of them notice the recently formed imprint of a body in the dirt beneath the car, nor do they see the oily puddle of crimson brake fluid just beginning to form beneath the front end. The car lurches backward. Miles yanks the wheel, then rams the shift lever forward and steps on it, sending the Challenger into a fishtailing rush across greasy weeds, then blasting out through the south end of the clearing, where a dirt road wends along the Flint for about 1.5 miles before giving way to the Crest Highway. If Miles had been less engaged with the mission and paying closer attention to the function of the brake pedal, he might have noticed the squishiness in the brakes when he brought the car to a stop in order to throw it into drive. But things are too chaotic now to detect such nuances, and besides, the line was only partially cut minutes earlier and is still functioning. The intention of the saboteur, apparently, is for it to blow out under pressure. Lily glances over her shoulder at the walker-riddled landscape around the little town as it recedes into the distance behind them. She can see the gore shooting into the air 1 mile away, the vertical stack of Tommy's harvester spewing like a Texas gusher. The sight of the combine mowing down rows of walking dead while the beleaguered town sits in a miasma of smoke puts a crimp in her heart. She shakes it off and turns back to gaze out the steeply angled windshield at the overcast sunlight beating down on the weathered pavement of the 2-lane rushing under their car. Miles has already hit 60 miles an hour, a lot faster than the state police would recommend on an access road such as this, and now the kid has his hoodie up and over his head. Lily can see only the front of his narrow nose, a few strands of his dreadlocks, and his boyish chin with its little peach fuzz goatee jutting out as he concentrates with practiced intensity, scanning and not staring, steering with his left hand, his right on the shift knob. Lily figures the hood is an affectation, an obsessive-compulsive habit donned whenever the young man is on the job, and that's fine with her. She needs this kid at the peak of his game if they're going to catch up with the preacher's tow truck, a vehicle that can't hope to match the Challenger for speed, agility, and handling. In fact, the preacher is about the only thing Lily can think about right now. The need for closure, for the termination of this madman's reign, burns as bright as magnesium behind Lily's eyes. This bloodlust so preoccupies her thoughts that she's completely oblivious to the fact that the car is starting to exhibit obvious signs of tampering. Of course, Lily has no idea that Jeremiah Garlitz was once employed as a service station attendant when he was in his teens, and that he knows all the tricks, especially the ones employed to quickly and discreetly sabotage cars. Mechanics talk about this kind of stuff all the time. They have chat lines on the internet, and they share inside information about how this kind of thing is not like it's shown in the movies. How would Lily ever know this? How would she ever guess in a million years that Jeremiah would try such a thing in order to ensure that nobody pursued him? How would she ever know that his scouts had found the Challenger's secret parking place? The truth is, even if Lily had known all these things, she probably would have still gone after the preacher. Rage is pulling her strings now, narrowing her thoughts into a tunnel, crackling in her brain like an overloading circuit. She can taste the man's death on her tongue. But all this is about to change as soon as they hit their first big downgrade. Tommy Dupree loses his voice after nearly 20 minutes of sustained howling, his triumphant howls accompanied by the collective din of hundreds and hundreds of walkers turned to pulp under the churning devastation of the combine's massive cutting skid. Over the rumbling of the engine and the clatter of the whirling blades, the wet, garbled crunching noise of cadavers being ground to pieces is tremendous, addictive, surreal. Tommy's voice finally crumbles into a hoarse hissing noise as he cries out for his dead parents, for his lost childhood, for his ruined world. The black geyser of tissues continues to leap up and wash across his machine, wave after wave, sluicing down the window glass, pulsing and streaking in the wipers, feeding Tommy's psychotic state. He has turned half of the super herd into paste, cutting a swath of annihilation from the edge of the safe zone all the way east to Kendricks Road, and he keeps going, and he will keep going until he runs out of gas or dies, whichever comes first, because he was born to do this. All those summer landscaping jobs, commandeering the riding mower until his neck blistered in the sun and his arms seized up with cramps, all to help his parents dig their way out of bankruptcy, and maybe to also thumb his nose at the kids at Rolling Acres grade school who made fun of him because he was poor and he had to wear those Kmart tennis shoes all the time. All of it has led to this. His destiny. His true calling. He is covered with a fine layer of gore the color of stomach bile, the suction of the wind blowing a mist of the walker's tissue through the vents of the pilot house. Tommy doesn't care. He also doesn't notice that the fuel gauge is on E and that the engine is starting to sputter. Fiddling with the gearbox, increasing the speed of the windshield wipers, he steers the machine toward the next wave of walkers coming toward him from the parking lot of the derelict grocery store on Millard Road. Through the slime-coated glass, he sees them reaching for the blades, as though deliverance awaits in the rushing metal teeth, and then go down like bowling pins, faces furrowed and vexed, eyes popping out of their skulls. The engine dies. The great revolving shredder in front slowly jangles to a rusty, creaking stop. Tommy leans forward with a jerk, the silence terrifying. Entrails drip down into the works of the Reaper. Tommy looks at the gauge to his right, taps it, sees the needle resting on the pin below E, and starts to panic. He unbuckles his safety harness and is climbing out of his bucket seat when the first impact shudders through the cabin, as though the earth itself is buckled under the machine. Something is pushing on the side of the combine. Tommy climbs across the cab to the side window and looks down. Scores of biters, all shapes and sizes, all whipped into frenzies, push up against the side of the machine. Tommy grabs hold of the seat back as another shudder passes through the interior. The right side of the machine levitates a few inches and then bangs back down as more and more walkers swarm the combine. Tommy holds on tightly, fingers digging into the upholstery. The machine begins to list, leaning to the left on its enormous wheels as the collective pressure of hundreds of the dead press in on the right side. Tommy lets out a scream, his voice gone, only a hoarse rasp coming out as the Combine begins to tip over.
Check that shit out. Down in the northbound fucking lane, there's that motherfucker!
As the Challenger roars along the plateau overlooking Elkins Creek, Miles Littleton sees the distant bloom of dust about a quarter-mile away on Highway 74. He points down at the valley of tobacco fields spreading off to their right, like a vast patchwork quilt in the gunmetal sunlight. The tow truck roars eastward, burning oil, sending up gouts of black smoke into the atmosphere.
Take the next turn off!
Lily indicates an intersection up ahead, a narrow dirt road snaking down the side of the hill toward the farmland.
Fuck! Fuck!
All at once, Miles is looking down at the dashboard.
Fuck!
What's the matter? Lily sees the intersection coming up fast, the turnoff on the right marked by reflectors on sticks. Slow the fuck down.
The brakes are fucked!
What?
The brakes ain't working!
Turn here, goddammit, turn! Lily grabs the steering wheel and yanks it at the last possible moment, sending the Challenger into a skid, eliciting an angry cry from Miles as he wrestles the wheel back in line. The car careens around the corner and plunges down the slope. For a brief instant, Lily feels the weightless sensation of a roller coaster, as though she might levitate out of her seat. The trees blur by them on either side, the wind whipping across their open windows, whistling above the engine. The car squeals around a series of curves, and then the road straightens out. The Challenger picks up speed.
We got no fucking brakes!
Miles restates this fact, as though it is an imponderable cosmological formula that only a handful of astrophysicists might truly grasp. He struggles with the wheel, keeping a white-knuckle grip, teeth clenched inside the shadow of his hoodie. The speedometer inches past 80, past 85.
Motherfucker must have cut our lines if you can believe that shit! Just keep it steady!
On the straightaway, Lily can now get a clear line of sight on the tow truck in the distance. A little over a quarter-mile ahead of them, a watery image in the heat rays of the highway. The Challenger reaches the bottom of the hill, their speed exceeding 90 miles an hour now, and the gravitational forces suck Lily into her seat. Miles lets out an angry grunt and steers the car onto a forking entrance ramp. The wheels drum and complain on the weathered pavement as they roar onto the highway. The wind buffets them, pounding against the open window.
Ain't even giving it any gas!
Miles marvels at this new development above the noise.
About to hit the century mark, ain't even touching the foot feed! Motherfucker, fuck with the engine!
As Lily checks the two pistols wedged behind her belt, their speed holds at around the 100 miles per hour mark, a surprisingly bumpy ride on the original shocks and pinions. The distance between the two vehicles is closing fast. Apparently, Jeremiah has the tow truck opened up, running at top speed, judging by the way the thing is weaving from lane to lane and smoking profusely. This section of the highway is relatively free of wreckage, but every now and then, Miles is forced to swerve to avoid the carcass of an abandoned car or the fossilized remnants of a camper lying on its side.
Shit!
Lily drops the speed loader, and it rolls under the seat. Up ahead, the preacher's truck looms closer and closer. At this distance, a little less than 100 yards, the human remains hanging off the tow crane are visible. A grisly simulacrum of something that used to be a man, the arms and legs long gone, the object now resembling a side of beef hanging in a meatpacking plant. The strobe, evidently connected to the truck's battery, still flickers at odd Pavlovian intervals. Lily stops looking for the bullets and stares at that blinking strobe. Something breaks loose inside her. Something unseen and deeply buried, triggered by that silver beacon flashing its cryptic signal. Looming closer and closer, the Challenger draws to within 100 feet of the fishtailing, smoking, gore-draped heap of a truck, and Lily feels the tide of rage inside her crash up against the wall of something far darker. A psychologist might call this hypomania. Active-duty soldiers call it a kill frenzy.
The fuck are you doing now?
Miles demands to know, when Lily tosses the gun into the back seat, her focus still locked onto that flickering signal light. He alternates his gaze from her to the front of the vehicle, which is closing in on the rear of the tow truck, the carnage-festooned crane close enough now to reach out and touch.
Hold on, girlfriend. Gonna ram it.
The wide grille of the Challenger smashes into the truck's trailer hitch. This shoves both Miles and Lily forward, smashing them into the dash, sending shards of pain up the bridge of Lily's nose, galvanizing her. electrifying her as the pale silver light goes on flashing like some out-of-kilter disco ball. In the cab of the tow truck, Jeremiah ducks down for a moment, flinching at the impact. Miles holds the car steady as a large fragment of the tow truck's bumper tears away and clatters to the road, bouncing off into an adjacent field. Lily pushes herself up and out the open passenger window. The noise of the slipstream drowns out Miles's bellowing shouts of anger and confusion. All Lily can hear now are the gusts of wind and the dissonant harmony of the two power plants roaring in unison as she climbs out onto the window frame, grasping the side mirror for purchase. Then she clambers onto the hood. The car swerves slightly. She braces herself on the air injector, rises up, coils herself, bending her knees and fixing her gaze on the rear deck of the massive tow truck, and leaps. Chapter 24. Lily lands on the rear edge of the truck's deck, her combat boots slipping off the ledge. She slides a few feet, clawing for a handhold, the toes of her boots brushing the pavement. Lily grabs the tow arm. The metal is greasy with the blood of the dangling corpse. For one terrible moment, she hangs there. Her feet drag along behind the truck on the rushing highway, causing the toes of her boots to heat up to the point of smoking. The truck swerves. Lily flops to the right. The human remains break off the crane and tumble across the oncoming lanes and into a ditch. The truck jerks the other way. Lily nearly falls off, but now she finds the strength, probably through the sheer force of her hatred, to haul herself back up. The wind buffets her. The gusts threaten to blow her off the truck as she climbs onto the blood-slick cargo area. She crouches down. The wind burns her eyes. She peers through the cab's rear window and sees the back of the preacher's head as he wrestles with the wheel and reaches for something on the seat, probably his gun. She quickly surveys the contents of the cargo hold. She sees small cable spools and railroad spikes and empty bottles rolling around. She sees an iron pry bar. She grabs it. She glances back at the cab window. Jeremiah is aiming his Glock 9mm at her. Before he can shoot, she swings the pry bar. The hooked end bangs against the glass but doesn't break it. The preacher flinches, the truck swerving again. Lily stumbles and falls. The pry bar goes flying. Jeremiah sees an obstruction coming up fast in the left lane. He swerves the other way to avoid it and sends Lily tumbling back against the opposite side of the bulwark. Behind the truck, the wide, grimacing front grille of the Challenger hovers mere feet off the back of the tow arm. Miles refuses to abandon Lily. Bad brakes be damned. He'll stay with this truck forever. Lily gets back on her feet and grabs the iron bar and swings it harder at the window. Once, twice, 3 times. The third impact shattering the safety glass into a sheet of diamonds. The glass implodes. Glittering particles swirl into the cab. The truck swerves wildly. Lily can hear the preacher scream. Jeremiah's Glock goes spinning across the seat. Lily lifts herself up on the edge of the broken window. Her hands impale themselves on the jagged glass. The pain drives her into the cab. She grabs Jeremiah's arm. Half her body hangs out the broken window as she tugs on him. Jeremiah writhes and curses. Lily yanks on his arm. The steering wheel jerks. The tow truck swerves across the 2 lanes toward the gravel shoulder. The tires squeal. The roar of the engine intensifies. The truck skirts along the edge of the ditch at 75 miles an hour. The wheels drum wildly over craggy, rutted sections of bare earth. The vibrations turn the cab into pandemonium. Jeremiah tries to strangle Lily. He gets one huge, gnarled hand around her throat. Lily pulls away. She falls the rest of the way into the cab. Jeremiah takes a wild swing at her and connects. The impact of his gigantic fist makes her see stars and gasp. Lily has short fingernails, but she slashes at the side of his face as the truck weaves and fishtails on the dirt slope. The truck leans at a 45-degree angle. Lily's nails rake across the preacher's right eye and cheek. Jeremiah bellows in pain. He loses control of the truck. It starts to tip. The preacher slams on the brakes. The rear tires dig in. Lily bangs into the dash as the truck goes into a skid. Jeremiah tries to steer into it. The truck slides sideways for a moment. Then, Lily screams as the whole world seems to turn on its axis and throw her against the ceiling. Miles lets out a wail. He sees the truck tipping. He swerves. The tow truck slams down on its side. In a cloud of dust, the Challenger roars past the site. It has no brakes, but Miles angrily stops on the useless brake pedal. In the rearview mirror, he can see the tow truck violently sliding along on its side. It slides and slides for almost 100 yards, digging a grove out of the ground. Then it comes to a dusty stop in a ditch. Miles frantically tries everything he can think of to stop. He stands on the brake pedal with both feet. He puts the car in low gear. The engine groans and revs, but only slows the car down incrementally. The Challenger keeps barreling along, a mile, 2 miles past the wrecked truck. He tries putting the car in neutral and letting it coast along the shoulder. This starts to work, but when a pile of wreckage looms, he has to shift back into drive and swerve around the obstruction. Then, an instant later, he makes a critical error. He looks back up into the rear view. He just wants to see if there's any sign of the tow truck behind him, but his gaze lingers there too long. When he looks back at the road, he lets out a yelp of shock. 2 large mobile homes lie wrecked across both lanes of the highway. The Challenger crashes through the center of the wreckage, slamming Miles against the wheel, breaking a tooth, concussing his skull. The car barrels through another 100 feet of twisted metal and goes into a skid. Miles wrestles with the wheel. The Challenger spirals into a wild 360. Miles blacks out as the car slides off the edge of a precipice and goes into a roll. It rolls a total of 5 revolutions before landing in a dry riverbed. 2 figures crane their necks to see over the top of a makeshift barricade on the northeast corner of town. "I'm going after him," the man mutters, peering through binoculars. In the oval field of vision, he can see the gigantic combine lying on its side in a gravel parking lot at the end of Kendricks Road. "That's a good idea?" Norma Sutter stands next to David Stern, wiping her plump hands in a towel. Her face still has the stains of offal she'd smeared on herself to blend in with the horde, but her smock is now covered with the fresh blood shed by Harold Staubach. She'd been caring for him for the last hour now. David looks at the woman. "We can't leave the poor kid out there." "The boy might be gone, David. I'm sorry to be so damn harsh, but Norma, listen. We don't want to lose another one of us in order to save somebody who's already dead." David wipes his gray goatee, thinks about it. "I'm going. That's all there is to it." He climbs down the ladder and goes off in search of ammo for his Tech-9. Lily comes to in the smoky interior of the overturned truck. Blinking at first, squinting in the harsh glare of overcast daylight flooding down through the gaping driver's side window, which is now the ceiling, she silently takes inventory of her injuries. Her back throbs, wrenched by the impact, and she tastes coppery blood where she bit her tongue. But she doesn't seem to have any broken bones. She suddenly registers the fact that the preacher, still unconscious, is slumped over the steering wheel above her, his lanky limbs akimbo, tangled in his shoulder harness. She regards his limp form. She considers the possibility that he might already be dead. His flesh is gray and pallid. She watches his big barrel chest and sees that it is slowly, subtly rising and falling. He's clearly alive. And Lily is about to start looking for the gun when his eyes pop open and he pounces on her. Lily screams and the preacher responds by wrapping his big calloused hands around her throat. He lowers the rest of his weight down upon her, the sound of tearing fabric coming from behind him as his waistcoat stays tangled in the steering wheel, the seams ripping apart. Lily gasps, convulses. The common reaction to stage 1 of asphyxia, and tries to get air into her lungs, but the preacher's fingers tighten. She instinctively reaches up and tries to pry them from her neck, but this is easier to do in theory than in practice. His vice-grip lock on her throat is steadfast, immovable. Jeremiah stares into her eyes with surprising calm, whispering something under his breath that sounds at first almost incantatory, as though he's putting a spell on her. Their faces are close enough for her to see the yellow tobacco stains between his teeth, and the tiny capillaries of red lining the whites of his eyes, as well as the grain of the psoriatic skin patches on his cheeks. She enters stage 2, the onslaught of hypoxia. It feels to her as though he's been strangling her for hours. Her lungs catch fire and her vision blurs, and she feels her entire body tingling as the tissues become oxygen-starved. She begins to involuntarily shudder in his grasp, a series of violent paroxysms resembling an epileptic fit. Her legs kick and tremble. Her boot heels bang off the floor. Her arms flail futilely, making feeble attempts to hit the man, when all at once her right hand brushes against something metallic and cold and familiar on the floor next to her, wedged between the mat and the door. She is about to enter stage 3, unconsciousness, a short jaunt to death, when it registers in her brain what she's touching. the 9mm pistol. This revelation is the last blip of conscious thought that zips across Lily's synapses before everything shuts down and she passes out. Lily Call has experienced lost time on several occasions in her life. Drunken binges at college, druggy parties with Megan Lafferty, the time she got in that terrible car wreck in Fort Lauderdale. But nothing even remotely compares with this. It's as though some cosmic film editor has cut a scene out of her timeline. She has no idea how the gun got picked up, how it got raised, how the trigger got pulled, or how the bullet found its way to such a critical part of the preacher's anatomy. The fact is, Lily cannot for the life of her remember aiming it, let alone firing it. All she remembers is awakening to the strangest noise, which at first sounded like a baby crying, a high, shrill whine that deteriorated into a rusty, creaking groan. Now she feels as though she's a deep-sea diver with the bends, frantically swimming up toward the surface of the ocean, toward sweet, sweet oxygen, toward release, toward life. Bursting out of the black water, she gasps and breathes in great, heaving gulps of air. Sensory overload assaults her. Her neck throbs as though rope burned. She's holding the Glock, and it's as hot as a branding iron, and the air is thick with blue smoke, and Jeremiah lies in a fetal position on the other side of the cab. He's holding his groin, which is soaked in blood, and he's caterwauling in agony, all of which explains the crying baby sounds. All at once it comes rushing back to her, how they ended up in a sideways truck cab, and how he was strangling her, and how she felt the gun right before blacking out. Now she realizes she hit the bullseye. She catches her breath, rubs her neck with her free hand, and tries to speak, but only a thin, wispy cough comes out. She swallows hard and touches her windpipe. It feels as though it's intact. She takes in a few more breaths and manages to rise to a kneeling position in the upended cab. She ejects the ammo magazine, sees that it has plenty of rounds left, slams it back in, and points the gun at the preacher. "Shut the fuck up!" Her voice is hoarse and weak, but resolute, determined, cold. "And do what I say, or the next one goes into your skull." The preacher manages to sit up, swallowing thickly, breathing hard and fast. His bald head is stippled in blood. He winces. He holds his bloody crotch. He swallows again and finally utters, "Just get it over with. Get out." She indicates the door in the ceiling that used to be the driver's side. "Now!" He cocks his bald head so that he could see the door directly above him. He looks at her. "You gotta be kidding." She aims the gun at one of his knees, but before she can fire, he struggles to his feet. "I'm going," he moans, and with great laborious effort, rises up to his full height. It takes forever for the wounded preacher to struggle out of the massive cab, lower himself down the front grille, and drop to the ground with an agonizing grunt. His pants are soaked with blood, his flesh is the color of wallpaper paste, his breathing is tacky with fluids. Lily climbs out of the cab behind him and hops to the ground. "Get on your knees," she says flatly, aiming the gun at him. He takes a deep breath, stands up, faces her, and squares his shoulders as though prepared to fight. "No." She shoots one knee. Jeremiah screams. The blast takes a tuft out of his trousers, sends a gout of blood out the back of his leg, and tosses him staggering backward. He goes down in a heap, holding his knee, howling in pain. His face is a mask of agony. He looks up at her with tears in his eyes. Why are you doing this?" She stands over him expressionless, thinking of Bob and Woodbury. At last she says, "Because the universe wants me to." Covered in blood and tears and snot, he gazes up at her and begins to laugh. Nothing joyous, just a dry, ironic, icy chuckle. "You think you're God?" She stares unmercifully at him. "No, I'm not God." She aims at his shoulder. "And neither are you." The gun barks. This time the blast takes a chunk from his left pectoral and exits in a fog of red tissue out of his trapezius, spinning him in an awkward arabesque and sending him sprawling to the ground. He gasps and tries to crawl away. He collapses. He huffs painfully into the dirt, rolls over, and stares at the sky. She calmly walks over to him. She doesn't say anything at first, just gazes down at him. "Missy, please." He's nearly hyperventilating now, his game show host face marbled with blood, his shaved pate looking almost comical. "Please, finish it. Put me out of my misery." Then she smiles. Perhaps one of the coldest smiles ever shared between two human beings, and says, "Nope. I got a better idea." Chapter 25. It won't be long now. Crouching in the tight quarters of the harvester's cab, out of ammo, out of options, David Stern thinks this, but he doesn't say it. Not in the presence of this kid, this brave, heroic, badass 12-year-old who took on the entire superherd single-handedly in this giant monster that he barely knew how to operate, that he'd learned how to run by scanning the fucking manual of all things. Now the boy huddles next to David in the metal coffin, shivering, waiting to die. The cab shudders once again, making creaking noises like a sinking ship as the swarm continues pressing in, harder and harder against all sides of the overturned harvester. Through the jagged opening of broken glass that used to be a windshield, 3 feet to his left, David could see the massive blade enclosure, still slimy with the entrails of countless dead, now bent into 2 pieces from the impact of the crash. He can also see the horde flocking to the wreckage, many more than when David first charged across those 3 blocks between the safe zone and the ruined machine with grandiose ideas of rescuing the boy. "You stupid, arrogant asshole," David thinks. "Wallowing in your own hubris." Only 15 minutes or so had passed since the moment David had run out of ammo and realized he had made a huge mistake, tossing his weapon aside and climbing into this battered crypt with the boy. Now hundreds, maybe thousands more biters have arrived to push inward on the crumpling steel shell of the Combine without forethought, without purpose other than to feed. 1,000+ pallid, mottled faces creased with torturous hunger, thousands of milky, cataract-crusted eyes fixed on the lone pair of humans hunkering in the tiny tomb that used to be a cab. Thousands of blackened, claw-like fingers raking the metal skin of the machine like fingernails on a chalkboard. "What if we go out the bottom?" The boy, with his bile-soaked sweatshirt and little rascal wheat straw hair that's standing straight up as though electrocuted, is pointing at the single square foot of a corrugated metal trap door embedded in the bottom of the cab, which is now the wall to Tommy's immediate right. "We could— No. It's no good." David sighs painfully. "Too many of them. We're safer in here for the time being." The boy looks at him. "We can't just sit here forever. We gotta try something." "I'm thinking." The boy crawls to the trap door. He fiddles with the latch, which was damaged in the capsizing. "I think we could sneak out of the— Get away from it!" David Stern hisses his words at him. "They'll get in!" "I don't think they—" The trapdoor suddenly bursts inward with a metallic clang that sends the boy reeling backward, blinking convulsively, shuddering in shock. Dozens of hands reach into the enclosure, hook-like fingers with blackened nails clawing at the air, flailing for food. Tommy lets out a yelp. David lunges for the hatch and tries to kick the Medusa knot of arms and hands back out the opening, when all at once a series of gigantic cracking noises spread through the infrastructure of the wreck, and David Stern turns just in time to see a nightmare unfurl before his very eyes. The walls of the cab begin to bow outward under the pressure of a sudden surge of the dead, and the seams of the Combine start to split apart down the middle. Rivets pop like firecrackers. Death stench and the clamor of collective snarls fill the airless chamber. Tommy shrieks and backs up against the vertical floor. David madly searches the cab for a weapon, but the shifting gravity as the machine tips and collapses into itself sends him to the floor. Tommy falls on top of the older man, and the two of them hug each other almost instinctively as the last intact section of windshield breaks apart. Ragged figures tumble into the cab. David pushes Tommy into the corner and grabs a mangled 4-foot section of window frame. The closest biter gets the pointed edge of the frame thrust through its eyes, sending spurts of fluid down on top of Tommy Dupree. The boy howls with a primal mixture of rage, terror, and repulsion. David swings at the next one, and the next, and the next, knowing all along that it's just a show, a charade for the boy. David Stern has no hope of fighting off an endless clown car of monsters flooding the breached enclosure. But he keeps at them, slashing one across the temple, stabbing another through the eye socket, gouging yet another one through the roof of the mouth. Fluids and blood and tissue engulf the chamber, and soon the bodies collect on the floor of the cab inches away from where the boy struggles not to cry out loud. He just sits there, shoulders trembling, moist eyes taking it all in, tears tracking down his freckled face. And when the older man is finally overcome, and he stumbles backward, tripping over his own feet and collapsing only inches away from the boy, the two living humans look away. They don't want to watch. They don't want to see the end come in its ghastly form of a feeding frenzy. They can sense the faces full of teeth looming over them, snarling, ravenous, teeth gnashing, lowering down toward them. And then nothing. No searing pain from the first bite. No convulsions of agony as more of them dig into the soft middle and the delicacies within. David pops his eyes open. Dozens of dead hover motionless over him and the boy, as still as mannequins in a forgotten store window, each biter resembling a dog being summoned by an ultrasonic whistle. One by one, they twitch their empty gazes off to the south, as though tracking the source of the silent whistle. David stares. The faintest clicking noise drifts on the wind. A flash of heat lightning flickers off the faces of the dead. The tableau is all very dreamlike at first, but with each passing second, it intensifies. An engine in the distance rises on the breeze. Tommy starts to whisper something in a startled voice when the strangest thing happens. The monsters begin to retreat, backing slowly out of the enclosure, brushing against one another as they awkwardly withdraw and turn to seek out the source of that flashing light. David sits up. They are wandering off en masse toward the sound of the engine and the flickering silver light. David sits up. He rubs his eyes as though awakening from a dream, and he looks at Tommy, who also levers himself up to a sitting position. "What the fuck?" Tommy says almost rhetorically as he watches the mass exodus of the dead. Lily keeps a close watch on the cracked side mirror of the battered tow truck. As she pulls slowly past the ruins of Ingalls Market, she moves along at less than 5 miles per hour, walking speed, in order to allow the greatest number of supplicants to follow along. The town is surprisingly quiet, considering the population of dead currently filling the streets and lumbering along in the wake of the truck. The air smells of brimstone and scorched electrical terminals as the breeze wafts through the cab's broken window vent. Lily downshifts and turns south, heading toward the train yard. In the reflection of her side mirror, she can see the preacher lashed to the massive tow arm at the back of the truck. Still clad in his stained shirt sleeves, black trousers, and boots, his gunshot wounds oozing now from under his clothes, he looks like a living figurehead on the prow of a ship, his arms dangling limply, his bald head lolling as he wavers in and out of consciousness. The strobe light continues to blink above him, a beacon drawing the herd. Every few seconds, Jeremiah lets out a garbled cry, a mishmash of words and nonsense syllables in which Lily has absolutely no interest. She merely appreciates the Pavlovian effect the sound of his voice is having on the mass congregation following the tow truck. More and more of the dead are gathering. They're already at least 50 rows deep behind the preacher, and their number is growing. Lily drives slowly past the station house, where the children still huddle with Barbara in the shadows, waiting for the all-clear signal. From the train yard, Lily turns west and makes a large, slow circle around the far corner of town. Lured by the eldritch noises of Jeremiah's voice, as well as by the flashing signal flare, walkers skulk out of speedway cloisters, out from behind abandoned semi-trailers, out of ditches and culverts and nooks and crannies. The mob grows. In her hairline-fractured mirror, Lily sees an ocean of dead trailing after the mumbled ravings of the madman. From the top of White House Parkway, she turns east and heads back the way she came. By the time she reaches the east side of town, the preacher is near death, and practically the entire herd is following along behind the truck, a vast field of walking dead spanning 1.5 city blocks and at least 200 yards deep. She marvels at the breadth and width of the throngs, visible on the funhouse reflection of her side mirror. The herd is so enormous that the seething masses in the rear, at the farthest point, are just a hazy blur in the overcast afternoon. Lily slowly passes the wreckage of Tommy Dupree's combine. She gazes over her shoulder as two figures climb out of the battered, overturned cab. Tommy comes first, lowering himself down the jagged length of windshield, looking like an animal coming out of hibernation. David comes next. The older man struggles out and squints into the steel-gray sky, taking a deep breath of life-affirming air. Tommy gapes at the receding multitude, robotically following the blinking light. He stares and stares, his mouth hanging open. David stands next to him. The older man just shakes his head in awe as he watches. Lily makes a slight turn at Riggins Ferry Road and heads toward the wide expanse of desolate lots and fallow fields along the Flint River Valley. Her destination is 11 miles away, roughly 2.5 hours at this speed, so she settles back in her seat and lets out a long sigh. Her thoughts wander, the mythic drama going on at this very moment directly behind her, the furthest thing from her mind. The great and honorable Reverend Jeremiah Garlitz preaches his last sermon that day, lashed to a gantry 12 feet above the scabrous land that he thinks of as Zion. In his scrambled final thoughts, he speaks to his vast megachurch of lost souls, who shambled dutifully after him in the dust of the Holy Land. He speaks much of his homily in Old Latin, floating in midair, surrounded by angels. He spreads his arms and smiles beatifically at the great assembly of the faithful following him, his Christian soldiers, his righteous disciples, their dark, dirty, impoverished faces full of noble savagery. God bless his congregants. This goes on for hours, Jeremiah recalling all the great chapters and verses, all the best sermons he delivered over his life in sweaty tents and backwater churches. The flicker of the votive candle above him illuminates his altar as the ragged parishioners follow him for miles and miles, many of them barefoot, bleeding, crippled, leprous, sick, old, and infirm. Toward the end of the journey, Jeremiah feels a loosening of his soul, a shade coming down on his field of vision, and he rejoices. He feels his chariot speeding up, his wings spreading, catching the wind, the angels lifting him up through the stratosphere to paradise. His last act is a singing out of joyous testimony in an ancient language, while the heavens embrace him. It happens almost too quickly for Lily to notice the sound. She opens the driver's side door 100 feet from the edge of the precipice on the south side of Emery Hill, the place where she used to gaze longingly upon her Walker-riddled town, and now she wedges the crowbar between the seat and the accelerator pedal. The tow truck lurches as Lily leaps out onto the rocky earth, the slipstream of wind and the revving engine drowning out all other sounds, except for the voice. Even as she's running for the trees of the adjacent forest, hurrying to avoid contact with the herd, and the tow truck is careening over the edge of the precipice, Lily can hear the faint sound of the preacher's voice. As the truck soars over the ledge and plummets 75 feet to the boulder-strewn river's edge below, Lily hears the bizarre ululations of someone speaking in tongues. Then the sound is drowned out by the collective growls of hundreds of walking cadavers dragging themselves over the edge, lemming-like, faithful to the last, as the light flickers all the way down into oblivion. From behind a thick grove of trees, breathless after the sprint, Lily watches the mass migration over the precipice, a magnificent cascade of the dead as row after row plunges off the ledge. Just before turning away, Lily realizes an excoriating irony. At last, Jeremiah gets to partake in the mass suicide he'd always dreamed of experiencing. Chapter 26. David Stern is about to give up on his watch for the night. Lowering the binoculars, he lets out a pained breath, shaking his head. He has no idea what time it is, or how long it's been since he slept, or how many hours he's been perched on the roof of this godforsaken semi-trailer, gazing over the top of the barricade, ceaselessly scanning the distant woods and hills of the neighboring tobacco country, hoping he might see a ghostly figure returning, beating the impossible odds of the previous day's climactic series of events. He stretches his sore, arthritic joints. "And how long are you going to keep waiting for her to magically appear?" a voice says from below. David jumps with a start. "Jesus! Babs!" He looks down at his wife. "How long have you been standing down there?" "About 1.5 years." "Very funny." He starts climbing down a ladder that leans against the trailer. "Do the kids finally nod off?" he asks as he hops down to the street. The safe zone, which encompasses 4 square blocks of Woodbury, includes several merchants whose shelves haven't been completely picked clean, as well as a small bed and breakfast formerly called the Green Veranda, whose rooms are currently occupied by the 6 children. Earlier that night, they set up a makeshift infirmary in the front room of the inn, where Norma Sutters, if she's still awake, is continuing to look after Harold. On the whole, though, compared with the hardships of living underground, the place is an oasis of luxury. "All except Tommy," Barbara says with a weary shrug. Her face is bandaged, and her voice has gone a little nasal due to the swollen bridge of her nose. But to David, in the moonless dark, illuminated only by a torch burning in front of the inn, she is the most beautiful woman on earth. "The boy insists on staying on at his sister's bedside with a shotgun across his knees." "Good for him," David says, and looks around the zone. "I'm still trying to get used to the quiet." He jerks a thumb at the wall. "There's a few stragglers out there." "Yeah, there's a few creepers around. Must be either atheists or Jews." David looks askance at her. "Huh?" "They didn't follow the preacher. Weren't interested. Can't say I blame them either, even though according to your mom I'll always be a shiksa." Too tired to laugh, David just grins and shakes his head and touches her cheek. "What do you say we go and try to get some of that sleep we've been talking about?" She's about to answer when they hear an incongruous noise outside the wall on the wind. They look at each other. Barbara finally says, "They may be Jews, but since when do they drive?" David turns and hurries back up the ladder, grabbing the binoculars, peering through the lenses at the darkness beyond the outskirts. He sees the headlights first, and then recognizes the car. "I'll be a son of a bitch," he mutters, and hastens back down the ladder. "Come on." He trots over to the truck cab, blocking a 10-foot-wide gap between barricades. Barbara follows. David hands her his pistol, then climbs up into the cab, fires up the engine, and backs away from the entrance. Barbara holds the gun on the opening. She thumbs the hammer back when she hears the rumble of a big engine closing in. David sits in the truck cab, poised to roll it back across the gap. Miles Littleton's purple Dodge Challenger, now as battered as a demolition derby car, booms through the opening and skids to a stop. David revs the semi-cab's engine, then pulls back across the opening. He hurriedly climbs down the sideboard with a smile on his face. "Thank God," Barbara says, lowering the gun, putting a hand to her mouth. Her eyes moisten. When the Challenger's dented driver's door squeaks open, she says, "Miles, we thought for sure we lost you out there." A battered and bruised Miles Littleton climbs out of the muscle car. "Nope, still kicking." He gives her a sideways smirk. Barbara hugs the young man, and David furiously shakes his hand, and Miles says, "And look who I found." He indicates the back seat. "Wandering alone out there, dehydrated as fuck, totally messed up." David and Barbara lean in and see the figure curled up on the back seat, unmoving and silent. Barbara can barely breathe. "Is she?" "Sawing logs, y'all," Miles informs them. "Snoring like a motherfucking bull moose." He pauses. "I guess she was pretty worn out." "Thank God she's okay," Barbara mutters, wiping tears from her black-rimmed, bruised eyes. David carefully opens the rear door, reaches down to Lily's dusty hair, and strokes it gently. She has a furrowed brow, a strange expression on her face. David wonders if she's having a nightmare. Maybe we should let her sleep a while, he says, backing away from her, gently closing the door. He looks at Barbara. I think she's earned it. I don't know. Miles leans against the front quarter panel. After she drifted off, I kept noticing her in the rear view, tossing and turning and shit. I think she might be having a major fucking dream. David thinks about it for a moment and finally says, let's let her sleep. He shares another glance with Barbara and then turns to Miles. Everybody deserves a chance to dream. The three of them gather at the front end of the car, leaning against the hood, idly chatting. David and Barbara give Miles some water and check his wounds. Miles waxes poetically about the benefits of an old-school roll bar and shoulder harness in a 1972 production line car made in America. They talk some more about the events of the past few days, and they wait patiently for their friend to work through her dream. And they will wait patiently, and they will guard that car with their lives, and they will continue to wait in the flickering darkness that night, for as long as it takes for Lily to work through the thickets and problems of her epic dream. This is Fred Berman. We hope you've enjoyed this production of Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead: Invasion by Jay Bonansinga. This program was produced by John Marshall Media. Text copyright 2015 by Robert Kirkman, LLC. Production copyright 2015 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.